With Russia hogging all the negative press lately, you might have missed Chinese President Xi Jinping's adamant proclamation that Taiwan will be reunited with the mainland. And he is not ruling out military force to accomplish this goal. But with the vast majority of Taiwanese citizens wanting nothing to do with mainland communist China and American President Joe Biden promising that the U.S. would come to Taiwan's aid, World War III is looking more likely, and it won't be starting in Europe. How is China going to defeat the U.S. and its allies? And more importantly, why does Taiwan matter so much that the U.S. is willing to fight to keep it free and independent? China wants Taiwan, and the U.S. wants Taiwan to remain free. Both sides have their various reasons, but there are some significant overlaps. For China, Taiwan is both a matter of national prestige and a national defense priority. The island is home to the Chinese nationalists who fled after losing the war against the communists after World War II. And given the difficulty of an invasion plus the support of the United States, reunifying this breakaway province by force has not been an option for China. It's only recently, with China's vast modernization of its military and steadily expanding amphibious assault capabilities, that the dream of taking over Taiwan is approaching fruition. But as long as Taiwan remains fiercely independent and refuses to bow to Beijing, China cannot be taken seriously as a global military power. After all, why should anyone fear your military when it can't even pacify an island sitting right off your own shores? For the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan represents an existential threat, though. The nation began as a dictatorship but gradually became a liberal and open democracy. Today, it's amongst the most successful democracies in the world, and that's a big problem for the CCP. As long as Taiwan remains independent, it remains a symbol for the Chinese people of what life could be like for them if they were no longer under the thumb of the CCP. After the extreme measures enacted by President Xi during and after COVID, disillusionment with China's government and the very society it's built around has skyrocketed amongst the youth. To many of them, the democracy lurking right off their own shore is a more appealing choice, and as long as Taiwan remains independent, it'll continue singing its siren song of democracy to the Chinese people. However, there are two very real and very significant strategic reasons for China to want to take Taiwan back and for the U.S. to want it to remain independent. First is a Western strategy known as the First Island Chain. This is a chain of pro-Western friendly nations that ring the shores of China and Russia both. During the Cold War, it acted as a physical barrier to communist navies in case of war, who would be hemmed in and unable to operate in open waters without being destroyed attempting to break to the open sea. The First Island Chain also allows friendly navies to operate very close to enemy shores by having resupply and repair facilities readily available and not relying on far-flung bases, which would limit loiter time for friendly ships and aircraft. Today, the First Island Chain strategy no longer hems in the Soviet Union and its allies and instead acts as a barrier to Chinese expansionism. China has attempted to break the First Island Chain by illegally building artificial islands in the South China Sea, and while the threat they pose is significant, it still doesn't allow the Chinese Navy to break the defenses of the First Island Chain completely, and it doesn't allow them to push hostile navies far enough away that Chinese shipping can continue to keep the nation supplied with the vital petroleum and natural gas it needs. Another strategic reason to want reunification with Taiwan could potentially impact the entire world, though. Today, Taiwan is the world's largest manufacturer of computer chips and semiconductors, wielding such significant clout that its embargo of Russia has all but crippled the nation's ability to build modern weapons. Taiwan's contribution to the global technology market is so significant that as the Chinese threat over the island grows, the United States has passed emergency funding for computer chip manufacturing plants to be built inside of America once more. If China were to seize Taiwan, it would in effect be in control of nearly all the world's supply of advanced electronic components and be able to threaten embargoes to nations that don't toe the CCP's line. A nation would have a simple choice: have its economy crippled or do as President Xi says. So how can China achieve its goals, even if it means launching World War III, and come out on top? China has already prepared extensively for conflict against the superior U.S. Navy, and has done a really good job of it too. The surface combat ships are still no match for American vessels, with China having approximately 2/3 of the total battle force missiles that the U.S. Navy has. Its air force is similarly outclassed by the U.S. Air Force, which not only outnumbers China's, but has far better capabilities in all but one department: long-range air-to-air missiles, where the Chinese PL-15 enjoys a significant advantage over the American AIM-120 in terms of range. However, the U.S. is fast-tracking an upgrade called the AIM-260 Joint Advanced Tactical Missile to not just close the gap, but exceed it once more. U.S. air and naval power won't matter, though, if it can't bring all that might close to Chinese shores, which is why China has invested heavily into developing a strategy known as Anti-Access Area Denial, or A2AD. The goal is simple: keep American ships and special mission aircraft such as AWACS and tankers away from Chinese shores so the People's Liberation Navy can operate with impunity. At the core of the strategy is the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, or PLARF. Plarf might sound like something you do after a bad burrito, but it's the gravest threat the US Navy has faced since the end of the Cold War, and it might be good enough to keep the US ships out of the Western Pacific for good. A ballistic missile force, this branch of the Chinese military is dedicated to China's vast stockpile of both nuclear and non-nuclear ballistic missiles. China was never subject to the Intermediate Range Force Treaty or INF, and thus, unlike the Soviet Union and the US, China developed an extensive stockpile of conventional ballistic missiles. Today, China fields about 1,400 ballistic missiles alongside hundreds of cruise missiles. Most of these are older, shorter-range missiles which we could expect to see deployed against Taiwanese infrastructure, but hundreds have ranges capable of hitting US bases in Japan and South Korea. A small but unknown number can even hit the all-important US base in Guam. The Plarf would be critical in the opening days of World War III. Both the US and China hold serious counterforce power, and the advantage would go to whoever fires first. A war between the two powers would almost certainly be a bolt-out-of-the-blue attack, an unexpected first strike using hundreds of ballistic missiles. The targets would be US bases in the region, with a priority target being Guam. However, this comes with certain risk, as striking US bases in Japan and South Korea would threaten dragging those two nations into the conflict. South Korea may be disinclined to join the conflict out of fear of North Korea taking advantage of the situation. In fact, for China to win, it would be in its best interest to proceed a war in the Pacific with ramped-up antics from North Korea, enough to rattle South Korea without actually crossing the line over into war. Fears of North Korean aggression would be likely enough to prevent South Korea from doing anything other than voicing public support for its American allies. Japan would be a different story. The two nations are famous rivals, and there's still a lot of bad blood between China and Japan. What's more, Japan agrees with the US that China presents a threat to democracies around the world. Losing a fellow democracy like Taiwan to China could represent a larger global shift toward authoritarianism. China, being the dominant regional power, is also greatly disadvantageous to Japan, whose all-important trade routes pass by close enough to China to be intercepted by its navy should Taiwan fall and the first island chain be broken. Thus, it's almost a foregone conclusion that Japan would join the war anyway, no matter what China ends up doing. The rewriting of its constitution allows the expeditionary deployment of its military, bucking the self-defense pacifist ideology of the past, and it's proof that Japan is actively preparing to send ships, troops, and planes to aid the US and Taiwan. This is a serious problem for China because Japan provides a convenient staging ground for both the US naval and air forces. A significant number of ballistic missiles would have to be dedicated to striking Japanese air bases and harbors in order to deny both to the US military. Chinese military doctrine states that the Plarf is to be used in a swift, precise, and overwhelming strike against an enemy force. This means eliminating the greatest threat to Chinese ambitions in the region, the United States Navy. It's not enough to shut down US bases and airfields. America has a huge expeditionary capability and lots of friends from where they could stage ships and planes. Winning the war in the Pacific means beating the US Navy black and blue. China is counting on the US's public aversion to military casualties to win the war the moment it starts. To achieve it, it needs to score huge losses to the US at the onset of the war in terms of both men and material. That's why US aircraft carrier strike groups are China's #1 priority. Not only do American supercarriers threaten all Chinese naval shipping, but the loss of even a single carrier would result in the death of thousands of American sailors. This is something China hopes it can use to shock and awe the American public into not supporting a protracted war. Because China cannot win a long-term conflict against the US, it simply lacks the material and ability to protect its trade overseas, while it can do nothing to threaten American global trade. With US carriers kept at bay with ballistic missiles and friendly airfields destroyed, China would have a week or two to achieve its objective of capturing Taiwan. However, China faces 3 critical problems with its war plans. The first is that any invasion of Taiwan would take weeks to coordinate. Ships would have to be restationed to nearby harbors. Hundreds of thousands of troops would have to be moved from various military districts to the eastern one in preparation of boarding. Supplies like food, water, and medicine would have to be gathered in the millions of tons and prepared for shipping across the strait. Hundreds of aircraft would have to be moved to nearby airfields. Basically, an invasion of Taiwan would be anything but a bolt out of the blue. It would be a very publicly broadcast event that would have months of warning. The United States would use this time to gather global support for either painful political and economic measures against China or to build a national military coalition like it did in Desert Storm. In an unprecedented move, European NATO partners have been sending ships to the South Pacific in the last 6 months. These routine patrols are meant to signal one thing to China: Europe stands with the US and against an invasion of Taiwan. Invading Taiwan would mean taking on an international coalition. And there's no ready answer to this daunting problem for China, who enjoys few meaningful alliances and zero who would support it in war against what would in effect be a global force. The second problem China faces is that though its ballistic missile force is a deadly threat to U.S. forces, it might not be able to effectively deter U.S. naval operations the way China hopes it will. Hitting a stationary airbase with a ballistic missile from thousands of miles away is relatively easy. China has reduced the circular probability of error from 100 to just 5 or 10 meters for its modern missiles. However, hitting a fast-moving warship in the middle of the ocean is a different challenge altogether. Ballistic missiles and other standoff weapons need good tracking data to hit a moving target. This means that a ship must be first discovered, properly identified, and then finally fixed. China has greatly improved both its ground-based and satellite-based long-range radar capabilities, but this type of radar can only tell you a ship is out there with an approximate distance. Accuracy of satellites, however, is greater, though they provide only a temporary track as they orbit the Earth. In order to properly identify and then provide a good track, you need a much better sensor technology, and it's unknown if China can foot the bill there. A vast investment in drones and AWACS aircraft means that China potentially has the tools to get the job done, but these airborne assets have to face the threat of the most capable air force in the world. China does enjoy an advantage here because the US would have to operate aircraft at extremely long ranges, but a decided uptick in both the purchase of air and sea drones by the US military, as well as a new tanker drone, means that the reach of America's weapons is being steadily and greatly increased. Even if China can overcome the difficulties in hitting moving targets, there's still one Achilles heel it has no solution for, neither today nor in the projected future. China depends on overseas trade for the majority of its oil and natural gas imports. It does have two land-based connections to Russia, but one of these, the pipeline from Sakhalin, would make an easy target for a cruise missile strike via submarine. That would leave only one inflow of oil and natural gas in the far west out of US reach. This would basically be a trickle compared to China's current fossil fuel supply, and within weeks the nation would run out of oil altogether. Its military could fight on for a few months at most due to the strategic reserves, but its economy would come crashing to a halt as the civilian sector becomes energy-starved. To add insult to injury, over 60% of Chinese trade comes via the ocean. Except it wouldn't in case of war, thanks to the US Navy. Even if its ballistic missile forces are effective at keeping the US Navy at bay, ballistic missiles can't stop the huge US attack submarine fleet. Surface task forces could also easily choke off China at multiple traffic choke points for maritime trade, including the Malacca Straits, the Gulf of Oman, and the Panama Canal. China is attempting to secure ports and airfields outside of the country so it can base forces near these strategically important waterways, but so far has only succeeded in gaining the use of a small base at Djibouti, only miles from a much bigger American base. With the bulk of the world on the US's ideological side and the vast network of friends and partners the US can use to leverage pressure on anyone contemplating allowing China to build military bases on their territory, it's not predicted that China's forward-deployed military forces will grow in any significant amount. The Chinese Navy may be the largest in the world today, but most of these ships are smaller vessels meant to act as missile boats or harass the fishing vessels and oil-exploring ships of neighboring nations, not attempting to dislodge a U.S. carrier strike group from a vital trade artery. For all its planning, there's nothing China can do about this situation in the current or even long term, though it is steadily working at building a blue water navy capable of operations far from home shores. It still has a significant way to go to get there, however, and even the U.S. remains firmly in the lead. The date is July 2019, and rumors of a military buildup of Chinese forces across the strait from Taiwan begin to leak to the international press. As the 4th of July is celebrated here at home, thousands of miles away, Taiwan begins to move their command and control functions into hardened nuclear-proof underground facilities. F-16s and other strike aircraft are moved into mountain bases, and dummy missile batteries and anti-aircraft platforms are set up around the island of Taiwan. August rolls around, and by now it's clear to the world that China is indeed massing what looks like an invasion force on its side of the Taiwan Strait. Though the Chinese leader Xi Jinping reassures the world that he's only interested in a peaceful reunification of Taiwan and the mainland. The American military is put at DEFCON 3, which signals the Air Force to be ready to mobilize for a potential nuclear conflict in just 15 minutes. As September comes, the Chinese military has begun commandeering civilian ships in order to help move its 1 million-man strong invasion force across the channel. The Chinese military lacks the amphibious capability to move more than a few thousand troops at a time, but in order to face 100,000 Taiwanese defenders and their 2 million reservists, the People's Liberation Army will need every available ship it can get its hands on, no matter how big or small. Across the strait, Taiwan has begun littering the only 13 beaches that an invasion force could be landed on with mines, razor wire, and other horrific surprises. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is fully mobilized by now, and the United States is at DEFCON 2. All military leave is canceled, and Marines board transports as they head for bases in Australia, Japan, and Guam. PACCOM's carrier groups disperse 1,000 miles offshore from Taiwan, careful to make sure that they do not stray too deep into the net of ballistic missile coverage that China uses to threaten American naval vessels. There's no hiding China's intentions now. An invasion of Taiwan is coming, and the entire world knows it. Taiwanese troops, supplemented by a few thousand rapid response American forces, dig in for what will be the largest amphibious assault in history. The date is October 3, 2019. The seas between Taiwan and China are finally calm again, presenting a narrow 4-week opportunity for an amphibious assault that only reoccurs briefly one other time of the year, in May. Chinese troops are rushed to waiting transports. The lucky ones board military amphibious landing craft, while the unlucky ones must make the treacherous crossing on civilian boats with little if any protection. Overhead, hundreds of missiles fly out over the strait, slamming into radar, communications, and control nodes all over the island. Airfields are cratered. Civilian power plants are destroyed. Chinese jets scream overhead en route to strike at Taiwanese tanks and artillery pieces, shortly after followed by Chinese bombers. Yet the Taiwanese Air Force has long been redeployed to underground facilities, and American-made F-16s flown by Taiwanese pilots rise up to meet the incoming Chinese planes. 1,000 miles away, U.S. carrier battle groups are given the green light to advance to forward positions just off the Taiwan coast, bringing a significant portion of America's naval air power. They alone are more than a match for the Chinese Air Force. Yet as they steam ahead, a rain of ballistic missiles falls upon the battle groups. Anti-missile defense systems intercept many, yet others manage to slip through and deal devastating blows against American supercarriers. In moments, thousands of American sailors are dead. And in the first 5 minutes of the war, more American servicemen have died than in all conflicts combined since Vietnam. By the end of the first month of fighting, American casualties will reach Vietnam War levels, with Chinese and Taiwanese casualties many times that number. By the end of 2019, the war will officially be the bloodiest conflict since World War II. But could such a war really happen? And if it did, could you actually be drafted to fight in it? The sad answer is yes. And in fact, American military planners consider the Taiwan-China situation to be one of the several flashpoints that would lead directly to a Third World War. China, for its part, has long claimed that it seeks only a peaceful reunification with the island nation. Yet, just in 2016, Xi Jinping stated, "We have the determination, the ability, and the preparedness to deal with Taiwanese independence, and if we do not deal with it, we will be overthrown." China views Taiwan's continued independence as more than the historical thorn in its side, but now rather as a direct threat to the mainland's continued communist leadership. This is because the island nation has only grown more prosperous and economically powerful over the decades, becoming the 19th largest economy in the world. Taiwan also directly employs many mainland Chinese citizens, either on the island itself or in off-site factories and offices run by Taiwanese businesses. The same cannot be said in large numbers of China's influence on Taiwan. Yet, even more dangerous than Taiwan's prosperity is what Xi Jinping and Chinese leadership fear the most: its liberal democracy. Taiwan's liberal democratic values completely undermined China's own hardline nationalistic values. While China enforces strict censorship, Taiwan espouses the same liberal values that America does, and mainland Chinese have begun to take notice. Pro-democracy demonstrations continue to grow within China, and as Chinese citizens spend more time abroad both in Taiwan and Europe and America, they are starting to bring democratic values back home with them. For China, Taiwan's continued independence is a deathly threat that must one day be eliminated, and increasingly, it looks like plans to eliminate Taiwan's independence are to do so by force. Yet, if China were to launch a war against Taiwan, currently one of the likeliest conflicts that the US actively prepares for, then America would be treaty-bound to defend the island's democracy. This would pit the two largest economies and military powers in the world against each other. And while the US would inevitably come out slightly ahead of China, casualties on both sides would be staggering. To this end, America would immediately need to boost its active military forces. The first step in bolstering American forces would be an immediate call-up of all reservists. With 860,000 reservists, any draft notices would likely not come for a while. Yet, depending on the scale of the war and America's objectives, a draft may ultimately be inevitable. Currently, America has two objectives to achieve in any conflict with China. The first being the complete destruction of its air and naval forces, and the second being the toppling of its communist government. The total destruction of all Chinese naval and air forces are a non-negotiable objective, meaning that no matter how the war went, unless it somehow went extremely poorly for the US, there would be no negotiations for a ceasefire until this objective was met. The US would direct all of its efforts and resources at ensuring that no Chinese naval or air forces survive the conflict. And the reasoning is quite simple. China cannot hope to fight a second war if its Navy and Air Force is destroyed, and a lengthy rearmament period would take a decade or more, giving ample opportunity for the US and allies to rearm themselves. The removal of China's communist government is an ancillary objective, which would be carried out via precision strikes, covert operations, and psychological operations aimed at the Chinese citizenry. Given that a purely military removal of China's government would require a full-scale land invasion, the US is happy to wage a war and not meet this objective, or leave it in the hands of a civilian population riled up by aggressive psychological operations. In the first scenario, it's unlikely that a draft would be instigated by the US government, given the US's advantages in naval and air forces both. Though both the American Navy and Air Force would suffer significant losses in the effort, China would indubitably face the complete annihilation of its own Navy and Air Force to the Americans and their allies. In this case, reservists would likely be enough to bring American combat strength back to manageable levels, and a draft would be highly unlikely. Yet, if the scope of the conflict expanded for any reason, and a direct removal of China's communist government was the only road to peace, an American draft would be a necessity. With over 2 million active duty forces in the Chinese military, the US and its allies would need to bolster their own numbers significantly to even attempt an invasion of China. All male American citizens and immigrant non-citizens between the ages of 18 and 25 are required by law to register in the Selective Service System. In 2010, the SSS had over 16 million young American men on file. Yet the US has a total fit-for-service manpower pool of over 111 million. With an increasingly bloody conflict against China, the SSS would without a doubt be activated, and full-rate conscription would begin for the first time since Vietnam. War with China is not likely, and yet it is considered the most realistic and probable flashpoint for the world's next major war. While the world has not seen any major powers go to war since the end of World War II, and it will hopefully not see them do so ever again, the reality is that several of any possible diplomatic missteps in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait could lead to an unavoidable conflict between the US and China. And with the life of the Chinese Communist Party likely dependent on forcing Taiwan back into the fold and crushing the island's democratic government, the US may be headed straight for another military draft sooner than any of us could have hoped for.
Early in its invasion of Ukraine, when the world turned a collective cold shoulder to it, Russia claimed that the Russian-Chinese partnership was one of no limits. Not long after, the Chinese were quick to rectify the sentiment and make it clear that there were indeed limits to this relationship, with its only real friends being Iran and North Korea. If Russia wants to win the war in Ukraine, it desperately needs China's support, but China has other plans, and it would like nothing better than if Russia lost this war. And not just any loss, the more catastrophic the better. Russia's war to defeat Russia by invading Ukraine is putting the nation in an increasingly tough position as the conflict enters the 18-month mark. Initially, sanctions against the country barely made a dent on its economy, thanks to booming energy revenues as the Western world bought up vast reserves of Russian energy in order to shore up for looming sanctions. But the boom times are over, and now Western price caps on Russian energy are gutting government revenues. These price caps allow Russia just enough leeway to keep selling oil and gas and thus avoid a global energy crisis, but not enough for Russia to turn a profit. In effect, Russia's greatest source of revenue has been reduced to a break-even state, even as the country taxes oil income according to the price of Brent crude rather than its own. This is cannibalizing its own energy industry just to continue financing the costly war in Ukraine. Even worse, as Russia switched to sell oil to India, they tried to make up its losses of Western business, and the Indian government demanded that all sales be made in rupees instead of rubles. This has left Russia with a massive quantity of Indian rupees, which have very limited use on the international market as most nations trade in either dollars or euro. Russia also doesn't need much of what India is willing to export, meaning it can't use those rupees to buy the Indian goods it might need. This growing stockpile of rupees is effectively worthless to Russia unless the world suddenly switches to the rupee as the global reserve currency in the near future. On top of income woes, Russia is dealing with a catastrophic shortage of badly needed products for the manufacture of advanced weapons. Sanctions on semiconductor sales to Russia have reduced its military to scrounging for chips from consumer goods like dishwashers, and it's being forced to buy drones from countries like Iran under deals that heavily favor Iran. In the wake of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the world learned that while Russia is a huge arms exporter, it was extremely reliant on advanced components from around the world to actually produce sophisticated arms. Without those components, the Russian defense industry can only manage to chug out a few advanced weapon systems per month, an estimated 20 tanks per month, for example, and in a questionable state of modernity to boot. China has helped alleviate some of the pressure that Russia is currently under. It has greatly expanded its import of Russian energy in the wake of Western sanctions and allows Russia to use its own financial institutions to undertake some transactions and evade Western restrictions. Further, there's good intelligence announced by the Americans that Chinese defense firms have been providing vital equipment to the Russian war effort. It was long feared that China would announce their full-blown support for Russia in a similar style as Ukraine enjoys from the West. Everything from Chinese tanks to artillery and especially missiles were feared to be crossing the border into Russia, replenishing its stockpiles and significantly expanding Russia's ability to continue waging this war. Despite Ukraine's many successes, it remains outgunned and outmanned by the vastly larger Russian military, which has the good fortune of access to vast stocks of Cold War equipment that still enjoys some battlefield utility. But those stocks are increasingly running out, and China was feared to be the key to replenishing Russian shortages. So far, there's been no sign of heavy equipment being transferred to Russia, despite President Vladimir Putin doubtlessly asking for it during his meetings with China's Xi Jinping. What we do know is that there is increasing evidence that the Chinese government is actively aiding Russia in evading sanctions, transferring large amounts of dual-use hardware like drones and computer chips to feed its ever-hungry defense industry. Chinese state-owned defense companies have shipped everything from badly needed spare parts for combat jets to navigation equipment. And just between March and July of 2023, Chinese companies sold Russia over $12 million in drones and drone parts. For their part, the Chinese have claimed that they're not selling Russia any weapons, which so far seems to be true. However, they also claim that any dual-use items being transferred to Russia are, quote, above board. This is objectively false, given that it took U.S. intelligence and third-party researchers to begin to discover the scope of what China is supplying to Russia. But it's not just parts that could be used in military drones that China is sneaking into Russia. China is now the largest importer of Russian oil in the world, dethroning India for that title in March of 2023. While Russia has not been able to make up all it lost in sales to the West, China now imports twice the amount of liquefied petroleum gas than it did in 2021. And crude oil imports are around 1.65 million barrels a day. One of the most painful blows to the Russian economy was sanctions by the West, which forbade Western insurance agencies from insuring any ship used to transport Russian oil. This meant that Russia didn't just lose access to European tanker fleets, but to international fleets insured by European companies. That left it with few options with which to ship oil, given that pipelines to alternate markets are few and so specialized that only very specific products could be sent through them anyway. But here too, China's helping Russia out by providing its own supertankers and granting insurance to third-party tankers transferring Russian energy goods. According to an anonymous Chinese executive, China provided 18 supertankers and insured a further 16 third-party vessels in 2023, shipping 15 million metric tons of crude oil. It looks like, short of providing Russia with weapons, China's doing everything it can to help Russia win. But on closer inspection, this is far from the truth, because the truth is, China is only interested in China, and even its aid to Russia is completely in its own interest, and it comes at an increasingly high cost to Russia's continued independence. Now, that last part is not a flaw, it's a feature of Chinese aid. China's been accused of using its Belt and Road Economic Initiative to spread what some have called, quote, debt trap diplomacy. There's varying levels of truth to this, but when looking at China's alleged support for Russia, it's hard to not see how China has its own interests front and center, to the great detriment of the Russians. Firstly, most of the transactions between Russia and China are now being conducted with the Chinese yuan. with the amount of total Russian exports conducted in yuan increasing from half a percentage point pre-war to 14% today. This is both a reflection of Russia's increasing shift toward Chinese markets and the Chinese demanding that trade be conducted in their own currency, strengthening the Chinese yuan directly. For the first time in history, the Chinese yuan is the most used currency inside of China itself for cross-border transactions. Globally, the yuan, or renminbi, rose to 2.7% of global foreign exchange reserves in 2022. This is good news for China, but bad news for Russia, since, like its situation with India, it's now left with huge cash reserves of a currency that only a very small amount of global trade is undertaken with. At least China's more sophisticated economy is able to offer Russia more of the goods and services it needs, and thus provide a chance to use those yuan reserves, but it can't provide everything, still leaving Russia with significant yuan reserves it cannot do much with. But the bigger picture overall is one where Russia is effectively forced to sell its energy for two currencies that the vast majority of the world doesn't do business with, meaning that the longer Russia is left under sanctions, the more dependent it becomes on India and China, since those are the only two currencies it has left in significant reserves, and nobody else wants them. China's political support is likewise completely self-serving. When Russia announced its no-limits partnership, China was quick to correct the record in order to not offend the West, where it has significant investments. To date, Chinese support has been tepid at best, with the nation calling for a, quote, equitable peace for both sides. What exactly that entails remains ambiguous, with China careful to word its 12-point peace plan in a way that leaves it completely unclear as to how it views a valid resolution to the war in Ukraine. In point number 1, China calls for both parties to observe the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries, but this peace plan was presented after Russia annexed eastern Ukraine. So, does China support returning Ukrainian sovereignty to the annexed provinces, or does it support Russian claims of sovereignty? Nobody but the Chinese know, leaving their position pleasantly ambiguous, to their own benefit and to the detriment of Russia. With most of the world not recognizing its annexation of Ukrainian territory, Russia needs a significant world power to recognize its claims, or it'll lose them entirely. But as the world becomes increasingly polarized between liberal democracies and authoritarian dictatorships, why would China not fully embrace a like-minded authoritarian state? Why, in reality, does China want Russia to lose the war in Ukraine? It all comes down to what China needs in order to continue prospering and pursue its ultimate goal of dethroning the US as the sole global superpower. And Russia has everything China needs to accomplish this. Relations between the two states have varied wildly, from warm friendship during the first part of the Cold War to mutual distrust, and even outright border conflicts in the second half. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was still the big boy on the block and China the junior partner. But the Chinese dragon has completely overtaken the Russian bear, with China now dwarfing it not just economically but politically and militarily as well. Russia's only remaining advantage over China is its nuclear arsenal, but with the state of the military on full display in Ukraine, there are serious questions as to the efficacy of an arsenal even bigger than that of the US. China's working to close that gap too, with massive investment in nuclear weapons in recent years, much to the world's detriment. China has a long memory of its treatment as a junior partner by the Soviet Union superpower, and continued by Russia until recently. It also remembers the territories stolen from it by the Russian Empire in 1858, under a set of humiliating treaties forced upon the Qin dynasty by the Russians. Russian Manchuria now includes the Amur Oblast and the southern half of the Khabarovsky Krai. It's not just national pride at stake though, as Russian Manchuria happens to not just be strategically important, but also rich in energy resources and, most importantly, water. With China experiencing significant droughts, water shortages have put huge pressure on the nation, and the territory stolen from it by the Russian Empire happens to have two of the resources it needs most today. Russian Manchuria is only the tip of Chinese ambitions though, because the greater prize is the entire Russian Far East. The RFE contains massive quantities of energy and other resources that remain largely unexplored and untapped. It is exactly these resources China is eyeing hungrily. Not only would it dramatically bolster the Chinese economy, but having access to those energy stockpiles would create a secure overland energy supply route directly to China. This is of significant concern when today China faces the very real prospect of having the US Navy completely blockade its sea-based trade, which accounts for approximately 60% of its energy imports. Without the ability to challenge the U.S. Navy far from its own shores, having a vast supply of energy delivered via secure land routes would suddenly give China a lot of freedom to pursue some of its most aggressive foreign policy goals that the United States currently keeps in check, such as invading and annexing Taiwan. For its part, Russia has not helped Chinese ambitions in the region much. In 2014, Russia launched its Arctic Development Plan and did not include any Chinese involvement, nor did they make any mention of plans to prioritize Chinese energy needs. That's all changed as Russia has turned to China to finance significant infrastructure and energy exploration in the region. For the Russian political elite in Moscow, the situation is increasingly alarming. Not only are Russia's energy resources in its most far-flung region being financed by the Chinese, but China's own investments into the Russian Far East overall vastly outstrip its investments by the Russian federal government. Immigration, both legal and illegal, is creating a population that is increasingly more Chinese than Russian. In 20 to 30 years, it's feared that there will be more ethnic Chinese in the RFE than Russians. A concerning situation given the 113 million Chinese are sitting right across the border in neighboring Chinese provinces. Tensions between local Russians and Chinese populations are already nearing a boiling point. There's a deep resentment over the growing crowds of Chinese tourists who are said to be rude and patronize only Chinese businesses. In 2019, tensions came to a fever pitch over a Chinese-owned bottling plant on Lake Baikal, which is the world's deepest lake and holds 20% of the global freshwater supply. This Chinese plant would not only block local access to the water supply, but ship that water to China, where it's desperately needed. The Russian outrage was so pronounced that plans to build the plant were deemed illegal in Russian court. China's not done much to ease tensions and in fact seems to have signaled intentions to eventually retake Russian Manchuria. In 2023, Beijing approved the creation of official maps which showed the territories surrendered under the Qin dynasty under Chinese control and with their old Chinese names. The statement was clear: China wants what Russia has. And this is why China needs Russia to lose this war. And the worse it loses, the better. Russia's unlikely to simply allow demographics to shift ownership of the RFE from itself to China, even as a growing Chinese population creates an opportunity for an independence movement or an annexation by China. It is ironically exactly how Russia claimed justification for invading Ukraine: the protection of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. In another decade or two, China will have this exact same justification to move to annex the RFE, a region that's not just increasingly ethnically Chinese, but financially too. While China could absolutely defeat Russia in a conventional war, Russia is unlikely to let the RFE go peacefully and could resort to nuclear weapons to defend its territory. This is where a crippling loss in Ukraine would be to China's advantage, as such a loss would likely come with significant political upheaval, exactly the type of chaos China could use to make a move on the RFE, consolidating its hold before a fractured Russian state could properly react. In the end, it'd be a fitting fate for Russia to have its own territory annexed by a belligerent neighbor, but it would be a significant setback for the liberal world order, which has relied on the U.S. Navy's ability to control Chinese trade to keep its worst ambitions in check.
Imagine the scene. It's July 2023. In a meeting, Vietnam's Minister for Culture, Sports and Tourism is furious, his face twisted into a picture of superlative disgust. Behind him on a large screen is an image of a pretty blonde American lady decked out in a smart button-up dress. "I want this movie banned," he snarls. "I want every single image, digital, paper, or even printed on a little girl's knapsack removed from this country and dumped into the trash can of fake history." He's talking about Barbie, a blockbuster movie that has divided the West on socio-cultural grounds, but one that's angered and offended Vietnam on a much higher level. Why? Because Barbie, as some people have said, is an assault on men, or according to another critic, is a flaming piece of dog poop, a Death Star-sized piece of drack that teaches children all the wrong things. No is the answer. Vietnam could give a rat's behind about polarizing Western world issues. What's incensed the country is an image that appeared in a Barbie scene we just mentioned featuring China's perhaps indelicate 9-dash line. In fact, the Barbie movie is not the first film that Vietnam has banned over this line. 9 highly offensive dark dashes demarcating what critics say is China's brazen territorial claim. Malaysia and the Philippines have also banned American movies over 9 dashes, a problem for Hollywood's bottom line, but a feather in the cap for China. The issue of that now infamous line has been heating up lately. It doesn't look like this story will have anything close to a Hollywood happy ending. Rather, violence is probably on the not-too-distant horizon, which, as you'll see later, has many citizens of Asian nations worried. The USA plays a major role in this existential concern, of course. We'll come back to the present scraps and squabbles soon, but first, we need to look at how this line came into being in the first place. We must ask ourselves, how can China be so bold as to claim so much of this area as its own? Are its long territory-grabbing fingers acting within their rights, or is China being the schoolyard bully of the South China Sea? First, you must understand some history to understand China's rather big claim. As some of you know, for centuries, China was quite an isolated nation. It was very advanced, though, so when those first Europeans went there and marveled at various Chinese inventions, the Chinese would often refer to those Westerners as uncivilized barbarians. When those enterprising Europeans started to exploit the world's natural resources, sailing around the world to do business and often kill and conquest, China still remained mostly isolated. During the height of the European Industrial Revolution in 1820, despite the British and the rest of Western Europe churning out newfangled money-making industrial machinery, China easily had the world's largest economy. That year, the country's economy was about 6 times bigger than Britain's, which was the largest economy in Europe. China's economy at the time also dwarfed the USA by about 20 times. In fact, China and India at that point together made up 49% of the world's GDP. The British went on to govern India 1858 to 1947. Some say rob India blind, but getting to China's wealth became a different kind of ballgame. Presently, China will waste no time telling the world about its superpower prowess in those days, but the country also believes the imperialists robbed it at a time when those imperialists were getting very good at making weapons. It's important to understand this widespread conviction in China when trying to understand the country's present territorial claims. In a nutshell, the Europeans weren't happy about China's isolationism. They wanted to do business. The Brits, through the East India Company, especially didn't like China snubbing trade. The Brits hated the fact that China would only sell its very popular products, such as tea and silk, in exchange for British silver. This created a trade imbalance, and one way to get around that was by illegally selling opium from British India to China. As effectively the first large drug trafficking cartel in history, the Brits went from selling 200 chests of opium a year in 1729 to 10,000 chests per year between 1820 and 1830. In 1838, Britain was selling about 40,000 chests, helped along by very dodgy Chinese officials and drug dealers in the port of Canton. Meanwhile, China had an opiate crisis on its hands that makes the US opiate crisis today look like an opiate triviality. The British were acting kinda like a big pharma/Sinaloa cartel of the 1800s. Millions of Chinese were addicted to this old-school OxyContin. A UN report said at the height of the crisis, 1 in 4 Chinese adults were spending their days nodding out on opium. Not good for society at all. In short, the Chinese fought back by burning a huge amount of British opium, and after some more incidents, the two countries ended up going to war. The Europeans, with their new technologies, were certainly very advanced. Barbarians maybe, but barbarians that could easily outclass China in a fight. The Brits by then had far superior battleships and weapons. China was riddled with corruption, official misinformation got back to Beijing, and so the Brits easily won what's now called the First Opium War. For the next century or thereabouts, Western European powers, as well as Japan, Russia, and the US to some extent, beat China up in a series of wars and conflicts that ended with brutal treaties now known as unequal treaties, and the superpower China gradually turned into what was called the sick man of Asia. It lost so much, including lots of territory, China was carved up and plundered. Imperialism is ferocious, Chairman Mao Zedong said years later, even if he was a tyrant of the highest order. China now calls this the century of humiliation, and often you'll hear political rhetoric in China telling people never again. For you to appreciate the present beef over these 9 dashes, you have to understand that bit of history. We only gave you a small snapshot, but it'll do for now. China claims that its 9-dash line, which encompasses close to 90% of the 3 million square kilometers in the South China Sea, is its own blue national soil. The country claims indisputable sovereignty over this area based on its days as a powerhouse in the region before it started losing parts of the territory to the likes of Britain, Japan, and France. Nonetheless, you'd be within your rights to ask why China gets this territory when indeed the South China Sea is surrounded by many countries, including Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan. You need to know something about the latter. Taiwan, aka the Republic of China (ROC), was annexed in 1683 by China's Qing dynasty, only to lose it to the Emperor of Japan in 1895 as part of the Treaty of Shimonoseki. This was another one of those so-called unequal treaties that China doesn't look so fondly upon. In 1945, the war ended and Allied China retook control of Taiwan, but this time under the ROC. The ROC had overthrown the Qing dynasty in 1911. After World War II, China, being one of the main allies, was judged deserving of a bit of territory. There were no real big squabbles when in 1947, a Chinese cartographer named Yang Huaren drew a line in the sand, or should we say the sea. It didn't really concern the West back then. China had just lost 15 to 20 million people, second only to the Soviet Union in terms of World War II deaths. This was an 11-dash line, not a 9-dash line. The reason for the 2 missing dashes is because of the infamous Mao Zedong, who in 1952 abandoned China's claim to the area known as the Gulf of Tonkin. The reason why Mao was in power then is that Mao's forces had defeated the ROC, which the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek headed. At the end of this brutal civil war, the nationalists, military, governance, and civilians retreated to Taiwan in their millions, an act known as the Great Retreat. They thought about coming back to reclaim China, but this plan, named Project National Glory, never came to fruition. The People's Republic of China, PRC, was staying, even if it was later weakened after Mao's crazy development plans, aka Great Leap Forward, and his bloody oppression, aka Cultural Revolution, that together cost tens of millions of Chinese lives. So there were 2 competing claims to China, but we should remember that it was the nationalist Yang Huaren who drew the map. When the nationalists skipped off to Taiwan, they still claimed the territory that lied within the 11 dashes that they'd drawn. Mao had nothing to do with the map when it was created. So, you might ask, how did China, the nationalists or the communists, think they could lay claim to all that territory? Surely you can't just draw a map and, well, that's that. Well, China might respond, that's exactly what we did. Often Chinese scholars like to point out that it was only doing what the imperialists in the West had done for centuries. And as you now know, China in its heyday was indeed the regional hegemon. It now says it claimed these territories during that period of strength. China says there's plenty of evidence regarding its historical claims. The country was never really a seafaring nation, unlike Britain and France, but China said it did do a fair bit of moving around the South China Sea. More so, it says, than the other countries currently claiming space in the water. There are the Spratly Islands, a 164,000 square mile area named after 19th century British sea captain named Richard Spratly. Right now, there's a military presence on the 100 or so reefs and atolls, not only from the PRC but also Malaysia, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Let's now take a look at China's claim. The country says long before the British named this area, in the 2nd century BC, it named them the Nansha Islands, which became the Changsha when the Tang and Song dynasties were around in 618 to 1279. China claims it was the first country to develop some of those islands. It also says in the Guangzhou records written by the Jin dynasty, there's talk about Chinese fishermen in this area. China maintains that the Ming and Qing dynasties in 1368 to 1911 wrote about the Hainan Island fishermen in the area, and later they wrote about fixed shipping lanes there. China also likes to remind people that the British Navy Sea Guide once stated Hainan fishermen dotted on every island live on sea cucumbers and shellfish. Some of them also inhabit the islands. Then in 1933, a French newspaper says China reported between Annam and the Philippine Islands is a group of coral islands dotted with sandbanks and submerged reefs which voyagers see as perilous and not dare enter rashly. There's also thick growth of grass, and some Chinese people from Hainan live on the islands engaging in fishing. On top of that, China says that the Cheng He navigational charts written by the Ming Dynasty record activity on the Nansha Islands. It says there are 2 Qing Dynasty maps, one dated 1716 and another 1817, which both include these islands. A Chinese website edited by Wang Xiaohua, Vice Minister of the Central Propaganda Department of the Chinese Communist Party, wrote, in 1883, Germany stopped its invasion activities on the Nansha Islands in the face of protests from the Qing government. In 1933, French occupation of the Nansha Islands met with resistance from Chinese fishermen, after which the Chinese government made firm its claim to the territory, which resulted in France's eventual retreat. China says in 1946 the Chinese government, according to the Cairo Declaration and Potsdam Proclamation, regained its sovereignty over the South China Sea islands and reefs and re-erected a monument of sovereignty on the main island. China also claims that in 1951, at the time of the Japanese Peace Treaty draft and San Francisco Conference statement, Chinese former President Zhou Enlai was quoted saying the area within the 9-dash line was China's territory. In 1958, in the Declaration on the Territorial Sea, the PRC again laid claim to these islands. We have a few things to unpack here in defense of those that say China still doesn't get to claim the territory. Many nations have texts that say their fishermen traveled through a certain area. That's not the same as having sovereignty there. There are even caves on one of the Spratly Islands that show us humans were there around 50,000 years ago. It doesn't mean they had sovereignty. And for sure, as China was easily the most advanced nation in the area, it drew up maps with the islands and talked about them, but that still doesn't mean China had sovereignty over them. Just because you draw a map and include some islands doesn't mean you own them. In fact, as China was exploring these islands, Vietnam was also in the area, claiming to have discovered these new territories. Both nations were doing the same thing. Europeans were in the area too, although when a 1758 map by a man named William Herbert referred to the Spratly Islands, it just called the area dangerous ground, and it didn't mention much else. It's true that in the 1880s, when the Germans started sailing around the Spratly and Paracel Islands, the Chinese told their ships to leave ASAP. And it's true that China laid flags down on some of the islands in 1902 and 1907, but this still doesn't tell us China has the legal right to the territory. In fact, China's history shows us that the country's land boundaries were never clearly defined. The argument against China is that China, the ancient civilization of China, didn't have any clear and defined boundaries, but now it's pretending it did. That's not how China worked in the past, so why is it trying to work this way now, say the Western critics? Chinese history shows us that suzerainty was always China's modus operandi, not conquest with added new boundaries. Suzerainty, by the way, means just having control over a country or territory, even if that country has some amount of autonomy and is allowed to self-govern. For instance, China did have suzerainty in Vietnam, but it never strictly ruled it. Another for instance, in 1770, Lieutenant James Cook, the captain of HMB Endeavour, claimed part of the Australian continent for the British Crown. He called it New South Wales. He told the indigenous folks their land now belonged to the British. The King of England had told Cook to take the land with the consent of the natives, but let's face it, the natives didn't really have a say in the matter. The Brits colonized Australia. Australia was not a tributary state. Right or wrong, those imperialistic Brits did not claim suzerainty. They took Australia and later dumped many of their criminals there. They also massacred Aboriginal people whenever there was resistance to the colonization of their country. Maybe Mao was right and the imperialists were ferocious, but that still doesn't mean China gets to claim any territory where once a handful of fishermen hung out in the water. Western academics say in China there was no such thing as claiming sovereignty over an area. They say the Europeans invented that kind of thing after 8 million people died during the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. These nations introduced the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which included the Westphalian system, a system that said there should be international laws and rules, and states that have exclusive rights in their territories. Asia did not adopt the law, not until the 20th century anyway. It's the international law now, but it wasn't when China claims to have done its island hopping. So China, they say, never had sovereignty over the South China Sea Islands. Making historical claims based on who was there at one point in history doesn't give you sovereignty in the future. The Diplomat magazine argued that if this was the case, since Taiwan was originally settled by the people of Malay Polynesian, then the Malay people have more of a righteous claim on Taiwan than the PRC. It doesn't make sense to think this way. It would mean Mongolia could make claim to just about all of Asia. Until recently, Chinese maps didn't even focus on the South China Sea. Then in 2009, China had a dispute with Vietnam and suddenly it took to the UN a map with 9 dashes on it. These days, the 9 dashes are a source of national pride. You can even find them in Chinese passports. China suddenly wants what it never initially claimed. In 2012, when these new Chinese passports came out, the government in the Philippines wouldn't even stamp visa pages and said the stamps must go on a separate sheet of paper. At the time, the Philippines was fighting with China over the Scarborough Shoal, an area where China wants air and naval bases. China's been very busy for about a decade, turning reefs and shoals into fortified military bases, setting off alarm bells in the Pentagon. In China's so-called Great Wall of Sand, what were small reefs have been dredged and concreted over, after which runways at barracks and anti-aircraft weapons and missile defense systems have popped up. This concerns the US more than fishing rights or oil, but the US can also put pressure on countries to go against China. Then again, China can do the same, as it has substantial power in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Just recently, China and ASEAN agreed to attempt to conclude their non-aggression pact on the sea feuds for at least 3 years. As all you historians out there know, such feuds could escalate and lead to a potential world war. Let's remember here that in a world war, these islands and reefs could prove to be a good strategic base. It's also worth noting that about a third of all maritime trade goes through the South China Sea, equal to around 4.4 trillion of trade annually. That's another reason why the USA has been sailing ships through the South China Sea under Freedom of Navigation Operations, or FONOPs. Critics inside the US have said this risks escalation, but it seems the US is not going to stop. The US has undertaken 9 FONOPs since 2015, which has infuriated China. By undertaking these cheeky journeys, the US is basically saying China has no right to these territories. So again, these islands meant less to China not too long ago, but now the 9 dashes are firmly implanted in most Chinese people's minds. They're told time and again that there will not be another period of humiliation, never again. Despite the shaky historical evidence that everything within the line is China's, the people are made to think the evidence is solid. They are also rightly concerned about their existence, which has improved a hell of a lot over the last 20 years. When Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke in March 2023 to the 14th National People's Congress, he talked about when China was turned into a semi-colonial society, when bullying foreigners plunged China into an abyss of great suffering and tore the country apart. The people listened intently. He had a point. China did get done over, but Xi's compelling rhetoric still doesn't mean China has a right to the territory. Nonetheless, China has done a phenomenal job pulling almost 1 billion people out of poverty since its economic boom. It's done well under its Belt and Road Initiative, spreading its influence all over the world. The US will try everything in its power to stop that influence from expanding. It's a big reason why NATO has been forming new partnerships with the Asia-Pacific nations, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea. Meanwhile, Vietnam banned Barbie, which, if there is a Third World War, might go down as something similar to Hitler invading Poland or Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination. Just kidding. We hope. Vietnam actually banned the movie Uncharted too for the same reason. Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines all banned the innocent animated movie Abominable. The 9-dash line barely appeared in the background in just one scene, but that was enough. They might not have the same existential fears of the US, they might have more financial concerns, although they might also be getting a push from the US. As we said, these 9-dash line disagreements effectively kicked off in 2009. That was when Malaysia and Vietnam submitted territorial claims in the South China Sea. China made a formal diplomatic response to the UN stating, "China has indisputable sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea and the adjacent waters, and enjoys indisputable sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters as well as the seabed and subsoil thereof." This contained a copy of the 9-dash line to protest the Malaysian-Vietnam submission. China claimed the line was widely known by the international community. Then in 2016, the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention Tribunal ruled that China's claim isn't based on any kind of international law. Even so, China rejected this ruling, and it continues to do what it wants in the region. The US has said it does not agree with China's claims, which is evident with those FONOPs it's been doing, but the US can't really do much about China's bullying tactics. It can't strong-arm the issue. The US hasn't even put its name on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is there to deal with such disputes. The country says part of the convention is unfavorable to its own economic and security interests, but that doesn't help matters where China's island grabs are concerned. It should also be noted that the US did not support the Philippines in 2016. As we said, these disputes are not only about China's expanding military installations. Countries in the region have been arguing about natural resources for years. The area is a fishing gold mine, while there's an estimated 11 billion barrels of untapped oil down there, not to mention about 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. No wonder then that Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam all stake claims in the South China Sea. It only became known in the later 1960s that hydrocarbon resources were there, and this is what reignited the interest in the region. In May 1970, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan held talks regarding joint energy exploration in the East China Sea, and that's when China started making new claims. In 1972, the Philippines struck oil off the coast of Palawan Island. There was lots of bickering to follow, and even though in 1982 a resolution was reached under the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, it didn't really address sovereignty issues concerning the South and East China Seas. Then in 1988, China sank 3 Vietnamese ships and killed 70 sailors in another beef about territory in the region. China fought with the Philippines in 1996 in what was called the Mischief Reef Incident. Later in 2002, China and 10 ASEAN nations signed the ASEAN-China Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea to prevent such conflicts from happening again. Further on, China signed an agreement with Japan, again related to energy, and in 2010, when China was looking like it was at the peak of its growing economic powers, the US stopped being neutral regarding the South China Sea. That's when Hillary Clinton said in a speech that the US had an interest in what she called open access to Asia's maritime commons. Soon after, China started building its Great Wall of Sand, and in 2015, the US did its first phone ops, which China's ambassador to the US said was a serious provocation. A regional dispute was now a much bigger dispute and became much more of a concern to the US in 2018 when a Chinese H-6 bomber landed and took off from Woody Island in the Paracel Islands. In 2020, Vietnam condemned China when it opened up administrative structures on the islands in the Paracels and the Spratlys. Again, China just keeps doing what it's doing and throwing its 9-dash line in front of naysayers' faces. The US sees China as a threat. China sees the US as a threat, especially with its new NATO footprints in Asia. Unless there is some serious détente diplomacy, it's hard to see how this all won't end very badly. People in Asia understand this very well. A recent poll was undertaken by the Eurasia Group Foundation, which conducted a survey in 3 Asian nations, Singapore, South Korea, and the Philippines. All these nations had significant ties with both China and the US. Read, they'll have to take a side. 90% of respondents said they're worried about a US-China confrontation, 66% were somewhat worried, 24% were very worried, 62% of all the nations said their national security will be put at risk, but 81% in the Philippines said that. Interestingly, around a third of the respondents said they have a positive view of both Chinese and American culture in their country, although some more people said they had a favorable view of the US at 70% than they do of China at 34%. South Korea had the most people that said they have a very unfavorable view of China at 38%, while Singaporeans, only 10% of them mind you, took a very dim view of the US. It's doubtful any of them want to be stuck in the middle of a war, but if the world can't evolve out of balance of power politics, that's what's going to happen.
The People's Republic of China is huge. Not only is it the world's most populous country, with a population of around 1.404 billion people, it's massive land-wise. The country is approximately 3,700,000 square miles, making it slightly larger than the United States in land area. Although China spans 5 geographical time zones, the whole country follows a single standard time. China's home to 56 ethnic groups. Linguists estimate that there are nearly 300 living languages spoken in China, with Mandarin Chinese having the most speakers, around 955 million people. China is governed by the Communist Party of China, which administers the country from the capital of Beijing. The country is rapidly developing and is on track to become a superpower. Here are 6 places China is attempting to subjugate to expand its borders, economic, and global influence. Number 1. Tibet. China has a long and volatile relationship with Tibet, beginning in the 13th century and throughout different periods in history. Tibet has been ruled by Chinese and Mongolian dynasties and has also been an independent nation. In the first quarter of the 20th century, Tibet was ruled by Great Britain before once again becoming an independent nation. In 1950, Chinese troops invaded Tibet to enforce China's age-old claim to the country. Some areas became the Tibetan Autonomous Region and others were assimilated into neighboring Chinese provinces. In 1959, after a failed anti-Chinese revolt, the spiritual leader of Tibet, the 14th Dalai Lama, fled the country and set up a government in exile in India. During China's Cultural Revolution, many Buddhist monasteries were destroyed and thousands of Tibetans were likely slaughtered during martial law. Due to international pressure in the 1980s, China somewhat relaxed its grip on Tibet and implemented reforms. Currently, Beijing continues to modernize Tibet, sometimes at the cost of the region's cultural heritage. Development has brought Han Chinese migrants and Western tourism to the area. Since the early 2000s, there have been protests in Tibet, especially on the anniversaries of politically significant dates. Human rights groups say that China continues to politically and religiously repress Tibet. Various activists worldwide campaign for an independent Tibet. There are several strategic and economic motives China has for governing the region. Tibet is highly important to China's sense of self and Chinese nationalism. Many Chinese leaders, past and present, have believed that no matter the lines drawn on the map, Tibet is fundamentally a part of China. They felt a strong nationalistic drive to return China to its ancient, far-flung Qing dynasty borders. Tibet also serves as a buffer zone between China on one side and India, Nepal, and Bangladesh on the other.
The Himalayan mountain range provides natural security as well as a military advantage. China is currently struggling to find a balance between environmental issues and yet not hinder the country's economic industry. China is hungry for natural resources, and Tibet serves as a crucial water source, as well as possessing significant mineral wealth. Since the early 2000s, Beijing has invested billions in Tibet as part of its wide-ranging economic development plan for Western China. Number 2. Arunachal Pradesh. China also claims that the region of Arunachal Pradesh, the northeasternmost state of the 28 states of India, is a part of South Tibet and therefore a part of China. Aside from India, Taiwan also claims the South Tibet region. Arunachal Pradesh borders the Indian states of Assam and Nagaland to the south, and countries Bhutan to the west, Myanmar to the east. To the north, the demarcation line known as the McMahon Line separates Arunachal Pradesh from the Tibetan area of China. Historically, Arunachal Pradesh belonged to neither China nor India, but was dominated by several autonomous tribes. In 1913 to 1914, representatives from Great Britain, China, and Tibet held the Simla Conference to decide on the borderlines for Tibet. The Tibetan and British officials agreed on the McMahon Line as the border between British India and Outer Tibet. The Chinese representatives refused the demarcation line and have considered it invalid ever since. When China invaded Tibet in 1950 and the Dalai Lama later fled Tibet, India supported the Tibetan government, angering China. During the Sino-Indian border conflict in 1962, China captured most of the area of Arunachal Pradesh, but ended up withdrawing. In recent years, tensions have risen as China has publicly claimed the region of Arunachal Pradesh. China is especially interested in a small district called Tawang, which borders Tibet and Bhutan. China has even gone so far as to destroy thousands of maps and make new ones, having renamed parts of Arunachal Pradesh with Chinese names. India, while not growing as fast as China, is still emerging as a regional economic powerhouse. China wants to dominate Asia and sometimes seems to look for ways to clash with India. Most importantly, it's strongly assumed that there are heavy deposits of minerals such as gold and lithium in Arunachal Pradesh. A large-scale Chinese mining operation found gold and silver deposits worth around $60 billion in the Lunzi County of Tibet, which is directly adjacent to Arunachal Pradesh. Number 3. Aksai Chin. China and India also clash over another border region, Aksai Chin, near Kashmir. Aksai Chin is mainly in Hotan County, in the southwestern part of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, with a small area on the southeast and south sides lying within the extreme west of the Tibet Autonomous Region. India claims Aksai Chin as part of the Ladakh region of the Jammu and Kashmir state. Aksai Chin is a remote, inhospitable region where mainly nomadic tribes roam. The area was ignored until the 1950s when China built a military road through it to connect Tibet with Xinjiang. India was angry upon discovery of the road, and it ended up being a major factor in the Sino-Indian border conflict of 1962. At the end of the clash, China retained control of around 14,700 square miles of territory in Aksai Chin. In 1993 and 1996, the two countries signed agreements to respect the line of actual control, the demarcation line that separates Indian-controlled territory from Chinese-controlled territory in Jammu and Kashmir. Not only does China want Aksai Chin for maintaining a direct route between Tibet and Xinjiang, it appreciates the territory for its strategic position. Aksai Chin is mostly high ground with an average elevation of around 17,000 feet. If China ever goes to war with its neighbors Pakistan, Kashmir, and India, the Aksai Chin region will enable it to take a commanding high position. Number 4. The South China Sea. As well as claiming disputed land, China has also claimed islands in the South China Sea. In fact, China has taken to dredging the sea and building out uninhabited islands such as Woody Island or the Spratly Islands to tighten its control over the region. 6 countries, the Philippines, Vietnam, China, Brunei, Taiwan, and Malaysia, hold different territorial, sometimes overlapping claims of the South China Sea, based on various historical accounts and geography. Adding to the tension, the U.S. Navy frequently patrols the sea due to its alliance with several countries. China considers this to be a provocation. The South China Sea is very important to Beijing because it's a crucial commercial passage connecting Asia with Europe and Africa. 1/3 of global shipping, or $3.37 trillion of international trade, passes through the South China Sea. Furthermore, the seabed is rich with major oil and gas reserves,
The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates the region contains at least 11 billion barrels of crude oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Also, the South China Sea is a vital food source, accounting for 10% of the world's fisheries. In July 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled that China had no historic rights over the sea and that some of the rocky outcrops claimed by several countries could not legally be used as the basis for territorial claims. Beijing rejected the ruling. More recently, some Southeast Asian nations have considered having bilateral talks with China to settle the dispute. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, has been working with China to create an official code of conduct to avoid clashes in the disputed waters. Number 5. Taiwan. China has had an ongoing dispute with Taiwan for decades. It views Taiwan as a breakaway province that will eventually be part of the country again. But many Taiwanese citizens want a completely separate nation. Historically, Taiwan was a part of China. Taiwan was governed by China's Qing dynasty from 1683 to 1895. When Japan won the First Sino-Japanese War, China had to cede the region to them. After World War II, Japan was forced to relinquish to China control of the territory it had previously taken. Civil war broke out in China in 1946 and ended in a victory for Mao Zedong's Communist Army. Chiang Kai-shek and his Chinese Nationalist Party, known as Kuomintang or KMT, fled to Taiwan. The KMT dominated Taiwan's politics for many years until after Chiang Kai-shek's death. Having inherited an effective dictatorship and under pressure from a burgeoning democracy movement, Chiang's son, Chiang Ching-kuo, began assessing a process of democratization, which in 2000 led to the election of the island's first non-KMT president, Chen Shui-bian. Meanwhile, China treated Taiwan with great hostility. In the 1980s, relations between China and Taiwan started improving. China put forth the One Country, Two Systems plan, under which Taiwan would be given significant autonomy if it accepted Chinese reunification. Taiwan refused, but did relax rules for its citizens to visit and investment in China. Since the 1970s, the U.S. has been a close ally of Taiwan and has sold billions in defensive weapons to the country. Currently, U.S. policy in the region has been described as strategic ambiguity, seeking to balance recognition of China's emergence as a regional power with the U.S. support for Taiwan's economic success and democratization. In recent years, China has been alarmed by Taiwanese citizens electing politicians who favor independence from China. Furthermore, the Taiwanese public has staged various protests about Beijing's policies regarding the country. Currently, Taiwan's legal status is unclear, in limbo. The country has its own constitution, democratically elected leaders, and its own armed forces with about 300,000 active troops. China wants Taiwan to return to the fold because of nationalism. Also, Taiwan being a part of China is a strategic defensive move. If Taiwan was to become an independent nation with its close ties to America, the U.S. would likely have a naval port and military base in Taiwan, right on China's doorstep. Number 6. Hong Kong. One final place where China is attempting to expand its power is Hong Kong. At the end of the First Opium War in 1842, part of Hong Kong Island became a British colony. Later, China leased the rest of Hong Kong, the new territories, to the British for 99 years. By the 1950s, Hong Kong had become a busy commercial port and a manufacturing hub. As the end of the 99-year lease approached, Britain and China held talks on the future of Hong Kong. In 1984, a deal was reached that Hong Kong would return to China in 1997 under the principle of One Country, Two Systems. As a result, Hong Kong has a high degree of autonomy with its own legal system and borders, and rights including freedom of assembly and free speech for the next 50 years. However, in recent years, Beijing has been treading on Hong Kong's rights. Artists and writers say they're under increased pressure to self-censor, and democracy has been limited. The current leader was elected by a 1,200-member pro-Beijing election committee chosen by just 6% of eligible voters. Throughout the spring and summer of 2019, large protests erupted in Hong Kong in response to a proposed bill permitting the extradition of fugitives to mainland China. Citizens worry the bill will be used to target, detain, and extradite political dissidents. Beijing's response to the protests has become increasingly violent as the citizens show no signs of backing down. China considers Hong Kong a bridge between Asia and the West for business and financial matters. Also, once again, China's domination of Hong Kong seems to be fueled by nationalistic fervor.
In recent years, China has undertaken an alarming expansion of its nuclear arsenal. With tensions between the US and China at an all-time high, the threat of nuclear war is increasingly likely between the two great powers. But how would such a war play out? And could there be a winner in such a conflict? The first step in analyzing a nuclear war between these two powers is to set the stage.
While the US and China have multiple areas where their interests clash, there's only one widely acknowledged crisis point between the two nations: Taiwan. The island democracy sits right offshore mainland China and has for decades resisted any ambitions by the Chinese to reunify it by force. The difficult Taiwan Strait is itself a barrier to invasion, with only 2 short windows throughout the year that tides are favorable for an invasion. Taiwan's own geography also makes invasion difficult, with just over a dozen suitable landing sites for a Chinese assault. The beaches themselves have been heavily booby-trapped, with in some cases pipes that run under the water and are set up to release oil which could then be set ablaze, incinerating Chinese troops in their landing craft as they make landfall. Taiwan's also been trained to reinforce its coastal defense sites rapidly and has the advantage of an invasion being loudly broadcast months in advance. As China builds up its forces, anti-ship missiles fired from mobile launchers can reach out and damage or sink Chinese ships on their way across the strait. If they managed to land, Chinese troops would face combat in some of the most densely urban terrain on the planet, with mountains cutting the island in half and making natural defensive choke points. It's not just an uphill battle, it's an uphill battle while you're being shot at the entire way. But for the first time in history, China may finally be capable of pulling such an invasion off. The United States is not treaty-bound to defend Taiwan, but it would inevitably do so anyway, no matter what the campaign rhetoric or political party might shout. Taiwan sits at the center of the First Island Chain containment strategy, which since the end of World War II has contained communist powers in Asia, first the Soviets and now the Chinese. Breaking this defensive line would allow China unfettered access to the Pacific and beyond, putting the U.S. Navy at a significant disadvantage in the region and allowing China to threaten U.S. global trade. And then there are the microchips. An invasion would cause a disastrous shortage of advanced microchips needed for modern economies to run. Still, these facilities aren't sabotaged or destroyed. China's seizure of Taiwan's microchip factories would leave it in control of most of the world's supply of advanced microchips. This would in effect allow China to bully any nation in the world into doing its will, including the United States. Failure to comply would result in a trade embargo and a crippling economic downturn. The supply shortages from COVID were but a hint of the tip of the iceberg, indicating what Chinese trade embargoes would do to the global economy. Would this regional conflict seriously put the US and China on the path to nuclear doom, though? It's more possible than you might think. In a war with China, the United States is projected to win in all but the most pessimistic of scenarios, and this hinges entirely on Japan and the Philippines denying the US the use of their territory to launch a military response from. A scenario that is incredibly implausible, given how invested both Japan and the Philippines are in countering Chinese aggression. In its pursuit of victory, the U.S. has 2 specific goals. An American victory would aim to deliver a resounding defeat to China, which would prevent any Chinese aggression for decades to come, to ensure the U.S. has time to rebuild and evolve its capabilities. To achieve this, the U.S. is committed to destroying the Chinese Navy almost entirely, along with most of the Chinese air forces. The third goal the U.S. would push for, but not be a requirement for victory, would be the toppling of the Chinese Communist Party. And this is where things can get very nuclear very fast. A crushing Chinese defeat in Taiwan would almost certainly spell doom for the CCP, with images of hundreds of thousands of Chinese POWs held in Taiwanese prison camps broadcast around the world and making their way into tightly controlled Chinese media. The societal backlash would likely be fatal for the CCP, which is why the CCP may be motivated to go nuclear early. This potential for nuclear escalation underscores the urgency of the ongoing debate over nuclear arsenals and policies, as highlighted by recent remarks from both US and Chinese officials. Given the complexity of this, it's important to know the context around how the news is being presented to you. And that's why I'm working with Ground News again for this video. Take a look at this story I found on China urging the US to reflect on its nuclear arms policy. Ground News found 40 articles covering this, coming from sources around the world, like the governments of Russia and China. 2 of the countries the US is considering deploying more nuclear weapons to deter. Since it shows you news from sources that come from around the entire world, you end up with a different perspective you might never have considered. I appreciate that they provide these visual breakdowns of a source's political bias, how credible their reporting is, and even who funds them, so we can see how each of these factors influence their reporting. Here at the Infographics Show, we genuinely love Ground News and use the app and website all the time while researching to make sure that our sources are as factual and unbiased as possible, or that we're at least aware of what biases might exist. Ground News even goes out of their way to show what's being underreported in the media on any given topic with their blind spot feature, like China, Russia, or even Taiwan. I encourage you to go check it out at ground.news/info. You can subscribe for 40% off the same Vantage plan I use for unlimited access. Subscribing not only gives you access to all the world's news in one place, it also supports my work. Thank you, Ground News. Currently, China has enough long-range firepower to shut down American bases in Japan and Guam for weeks, maybe even months. It's doubtful China would also strike at South Korean bases, as South Korea would likely prohibit the US from launching combat operations on its soil against China. South Korea is no friend to China, but China has the ultimate trump card against South Korea, North Korea. The simple threat of letting Kim off his leash would be enough to ensure the South and its territory remains neutral. However, China's impressive supply of long-range missiles will in fact run out, and pretty soon after hostilities start. Unlike combat aircraft, China's People's Liberation Army rocket force is a single-use item. Once a missile's been fired at an American runway, it's gone forever. Thus, a mass attack may shut down some of the US's most important regional bases for weeks, possibly months, but they can and would be repaired. American crews can already repair a cratered runway in a matter of hours. Thus, to keep facilities shut down, China would have to launch attacks against them routinely, something it would quickly lose the ability to do. But there's a more long-term solution, and that's the use of weapons of mass destruction. Guam is the linchpin of the American Pacific power. From here, the US projects power across all the Western Pacific, and its naval installations can handle everything from aircraft carriers to submarines. Its runways are large enough for even the US's biggest bombers, the B-52. And with the help of tankers, long-range strategic aircraft could even reach China's shores and deeper inland. Guam's medical and repair facilities would be crucial to any war in the Pacific, as losses from Chinese attacks mount, and ships, sailors, and airmen need to be pulled back for treatment. Shut down Guam, and despite the US's network of allied bases across the Pacific, you create a significant bottleneck for the US military, exactly the type of advantage China needs to secure victory in Taiwan before the US can fully respond. The use of a weapon of mass destruction against Guam would achieve precisely this effect. A regular nuclear weapon would be bad enough, causing catastrophic damage that might shut Guam down for as much as a year. However, another class of nuclear weapons is far better suited for the task. Known as enhanced radiation weapons, these bombs are perfectly suited for long-term area denial, causing not just destruction on the ground, but irradiating the surrounding countryside. Also known as salted bombs after the term salt the earth, which was an ancient practice to prevent farmlands from being usable by an enemy, these weapons are part of what's called radiological warfare. Never practiced in real life, the concept has been proposed at least twice. Once during the Korean War, when American General Douglas MacArthur proposed using nuclear fallout to create a border that would keep the Chinese out, and again in 2012, when British politician John William Gilbert proposed that salted weapons could be used in the mountains of Afghanistan to create a barrier that would prevent infiltration of militants from Pakistan into the country. Salted weapons differ from other ERWs like neutron bombs in their area of denial use. For instance, during the Cold War, the US created neutron bombs that would cause relatively little damage to the countryside, but emit high amounts of radiation meant to kill Soviet tank crews and thus break up their massive armored assaults. However, a salted weapon would make the land completely inhospitable to life for a very long time. In this regard, a salted nuclear attack on Guam or another key American facility becomes an incredibly attractive option for Chinese military planners facing an inevitable onslaught of US firepower. China already has the experience to create these weapons, having tested a neutron bomb in the past. While there's no indication China has any salted bombs today, creating one would not be difficult. A standard neutron bomb could be turned into a salted bomb simply by encasing it in a thick shell of neutron-activated material and then exploding directly on the surface. Typically, nuclear weapons explode several hundred meters above their target to maximize explosive power, as a ground burst would lead to much of the energy being absorbed by terrain and structures. Air bursts also benefit from sending most of their radiation up into space or the upper atmosphere. However, a ground burst would vaporize millions of tons of soil and irradiate it, casting it across a wide area. A single salted bomb could be enough to shut down Guam until a massive, extremely expensive cleanup effort could be undertaken. Yet, China knows that the United States would inevitably respond, So clearly, any worries about a nuclear war between the two powers are overblown, and we're just trying to get clicks, right? Not quite. As stated earlier, the CCP's very survival would be at stake in any war against the US, and if the tide turns overwhelmingly and decisively against China, pure desperation could see China willing to trade a few nuclear blows to ensure victory. The advantage that China has here is that it knows it's dealing with a rational actor, the United States, and has a global responsibility that rogue nations such as Russia do not. Thus, China can be confident that in any response, the US would be proportional if punishing. There is the possibility then that China could gamble that losing a military facility of its own would be worth the devastating strategic blow that losing Guam would be to America. Except the US is unlikely to engage in tit-for-tat, which would only encourage further similarly cold-blooded calculations on the future use of nuclear weapons. Instead, the US would want to send an overwhelming message that the use of nuclear weapons is never worth the cost. Rather than hitting a single Chinese facility, the US would likely opt for a 2-to-1 exchange, dealing 2 nuclear blows to China's 1. At this point, the room for significant miscalculations makes doomsday extremely possible. Could the CCP stomach losing 2 major military bases for 1 American? Could Chinese pride bear the cost of losing 2 facilities and thousands of lives? What if the US strikes the wrong bases? An attack on less populated areas would limit civilian and collateral damage. But what if the US opts to send a harsher message by striking something like the naval facilities being used to sustain the Taiwanese invasion, which all sit adjacent to major population centers? In fact, given the loss of Guam, this is precisely the target the US would be likely to strike the most to bottleneck the Chinese assault in the same fashion that a US military entry into the Pacific has been bottlenecked. At that point, we're off to the races, galloping along with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Technically, China has a no first-use policy, yet such a policy could mean little in the face of existential defeat. So now it's all about the weapons. In a recent buildup of its nuclear forces, China has developed an arsenal of an estimated 500+ nuclear weapons, with many more on the way as construction continues and expanded missile bases. The end goal of Chinese expansion is unknown, but it could be aiming to reach a goal similar to the US's 3,700 active nuclear weapons. This isn't just a matter of deterring an attack on itself, the stated goal of any nation's nuclear arsenal, but rather matching the United States pound for pound would further legitimize China's rise to an international power. In a full-blooded exchange between the two states, not all these weapons would be used, though. Only a portion of the stockpile would be utilized in a nuclear war, with a strategic reserve kept for post-war deterrence. Any nation ravaged by a nuclear conflict is going to be cripplingly weak, but the major nuclear powers maintain a stockpile of nuclear weapons that's large enough to still have a significant capability even after a major nuclear exchange. This strategic reserve serves to deter any further aggression from other powers looking to capitalize on current weakness. Of course, such a concept is likely ludicrous, as even a nuclear exchange between just 2 nations would usher in a global climate catastrophe. If 2 nations with as many weapons as China and the US were to engage in total nuclear war, humanity wouldn't likely go extinct, but billions would die from the resulting fallout, climate disruption, and a collapse of global supply chains. Knowing that a portion of both sides' weapons could remain in reserve limits how many weapons would be used in case of war. Currently, China does not have the capability to fully destroy the United States in a nuclear exchange, while the US does in fact have the capability to fully destroy China if it wishes. That's because of multiple factors working against China, the first of which is corruption. Recently, the People's Liberation Army rocket force was rocked by a corruption scandal that's been unfolding for months. While rumors that Chinese missiles were full of water instead of fuel are almost certainly a mistranslation of a Chinese idiom, the fact is that numerous PLARF officers have been fired on corruption charges, including the commander of the entire PLARF himself. A whopping 5 past or current commanders of the PLARF have been removed from their posts in the National People's Congress, an essential first step before prosecution, as NPC members are immune from prosecution. And it's not just the PLARF officers being jailed, it's also aerospace executives related to the PLARF. In March 2023, China's Minister of Defense was forced to resign. He too was a former PLARF commander and hasn't been heard from since. a former PLARF deputy and head of the 3rd Department, China's former equivalent to the U.S.'s National Security Agency, was found dead after a very sudden and unexpected illness. Unlike Russia, in China, when you become publicly disgraced, you don't fall out of a window. Instead, you develop an extremely rapid form of immediately lethal cancer. What does this corruption have to do with China's nuclear weapons? Well, U.S. intelligence reports that some of the silos for China's missiles don't work correctly due to graft. In 2015, a study by Charney Research showed that 35% of all firms in China reported having to bribe Chinese officials with bribes or gifts. In 2023, China ranked 76 out of 180 countries in Transparency.org's International Corruption Index. Though given how tightly controlled information in China is, the real amount of corruption is unknown. Back to that 2015 study though, a whopping 41% of surveyed construction firms reported having to pay bribes to public officials in order to operate. And that's a significant indicator of China's real corruption problem. Shoddy construction techniques also plague China, with a Chinese dam built in Ecuador being shut down after 4 years of operation due to serious construction flaws. Likewise, Chinese dams in Pakistan and Uganda bore as many as 500 structural deficiencies, with Uganda forced to keep operating its dams despite the safety risk due to its inability to pay for repairs and need for electricity. Similar problems have plagued other major Chinese construction efforts, both abroad and at home, and the Chinese have a term for it: tofu dreg project. The term originates from leftover pieces after one makes tofu and references the use of shoddy work and poor materials in Chinese construction. After the 2008 Wenchuan earthquake caused schoolhouses to collapse and kill students inside, the term gained widespread popularity. Chinese apartment buildings are notorious for being tofu buildings, with cheap iron wire instead of steel rods used to reinforce concrete, and inferior-grade cement that crumbles in your hand. Protesters and journalists who have complained about the issue have been intimidated or simply jailed. The allegations that Chinese missile silo doors do not function properly are well-founded and will take many years to correct. This leaves China with the proposition of not having a fully reliable nuclear deterrent, decreasing its ability to take on the U.S. in a nuclear exchange. Then there are U.S. missile defenses, which are growing year over year. The ground-based interceptor is a stockpile of 40 interceptors based at Fort Greely, Alaska, and 4 at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. The system will soon receive 31 replacements of the new next-generation interceptor, and the U.S. plans to field over 60 of them by the end of the decade. However, the GBI program is controversial, to say the least. During testing, GBIs had numerous intercept failures, with only 4 out of 7 tests being successful. And even then, there are allegations that GBIs were never tested against realistic threats. Realistic threats would use countermeasures to confuse any incoming interceptors, and it's unknown if GBIs can intercept a missile before it releases a payload of independently targeting warheads, significantly cutting down its efficacy. The GBI system is best used as a defense against a rogue state, such as North Korea, rather than to be relied on as a solid missile defense in case of atomic war. However, there's also America's fleet of Aegis vessels, which feature the Aegis BMD, or Ballistic Missile Defense System. This allows U.S. Aegis vessels to intercept ballistic missiles during the mid-course phase using standard missile interceptors. Unlike GBI, Aegis BMD has a high degree of confidence, but it's limited by vessel and missile availability. Defending vessels would also have to be in the right geographic position to actually intercept Chinese missiles, and given the conventional ballistic missile threat in the Pacific, it's unknown how many would be on hand to defend the homeland in case of a sudden nuclear exchange. Other systems such as the Patriot and THAAD can also help defend the homeland, but are of limited availability given the need to protect many overseas U.S. installations from the ever-increasing missile threat they face. All in all, though, once Chinese corruption and U.S. missile defenses are calculated, perhaps anywhere from 25% to 50% of Chinese missiles might be intercepted or simply fail to leave their silos. That's still not good news for most of America. For both nations, the first targets to be struck would be their missile fields. The hope would be to strike before more missiles can be fired, and both nations have widely dispersed their missile fields to make this more difficult to achieve. Inadvertently, though, these massive missile fields also serve as nuclear sponges, absorbing attacks that might have been leveraged elsewhere. If you live in the desert regions of China or the Great Plains of the United States, you're basically a meat shield for the rest of your country. The second wave of attacks would be against nuclear weapon depots and strategic bomber air bases, with the intent of shutting down the enemy's ability to launch an air wing of a nuclear triad. Destruction of nuclear depots would also limit the enemy's ability to rearm and launch a follow-on attack. Next on the atomic chopping block are command and control and major logistic nodes, meant to paralyze a nation's ability to communicate with, move, or supply its military. The major naval bases, especially those that can host submarines, would be struck during the wave of military attacks, hopefully shutting down the enemy's ability to rearm or service its ballistic missile fleet. Now we move on to civilian targets. Other than major cities and each nation's capital, a significant number of strikes would target major infrastructure or croplands. The US is the breadbasket of the world and a major food exporter, and all that fertile farmland in the American flyover states would be irradiated beyond use through nuclear carpet bombing. Likewise, Chinese farming sectors would be under American nuclear attack, and major infrastructure projects like Three Gorges Dam would come under either nuclear or conventional attack courtesy of US submarines. The destruction of the Three Gorges Dam alone would be akin to a WMD event, even if destroyed by conventional means. The sudden flooding would result in millions of deaths and destroy numerous cities in the path of the flooding. The goal of nuclear war between the two powers would be to bring each other to their knees through the complete destruction of national infrastructure and military capability. The irradiation of major food-producing regions would ensure devastating famines that would kill hundreds of millions on either side, even if major population centers were completely untouched. And while nuclear war is no way a winnable proposition for anyone, the United States, at least, is in a far better position to emerge, having lost less than China. Day 1. It's the dead of night over the East China Sea. For several days now, Xi Jinping has been moving his fleet of 6 Shang-class Type 93 submarines into position. Each is just over 360 feet long and is capable of firing cruise missiles at naval and terrestrial targets. Those submarines are converging in the East China Sea with one target in mind: the Okinawa Naval Base. The base, which the United States has established with Japan to protect both its own military ambitions and further its trilateral relationship with Japan and South Korea, is home to around 3,000 active troops. It's the largest American base in Japan and likely would be the first to launch a counterattack in the wake of Chinese aggression. Jinping knows this, and that's why he's launching a sneak attack to take out the base and turn it into a non-factor. Better yet for Xi, Okinawa hosts around 70% of all America's military bases in Japan. While his submarines strike the Okinawa Naval Base, he'll unleash scores of Shan H-6, Nanchang Q-5, and Tupolev Tu-16 bomber planes to attack other American bases on the Japanese island. He doesn't anticipate the total destruction of all these bases, but as an opening salvo in his war against the US, he believes the attack will not only weaken America, but make Japan less likely to be capable of launching an immediate response. The order is given. The Type 93 submarines launch their cruise missiles, and YJ-18 supersonic cruise missiles fly into the sky, their advanced guidance systems pointing them toward America's Okinawan base. The submarines also deploy the rest of their loadouts. YJ-82 anti-ship missiles strike the vessels that America has stationed in the East China Sea, with rocket mines and powerful torpedoes causing further damage. At the same time, China's bombers take off from its Fujian aircraft carrier. They speed toward Okinawa, avoiding air defense systems thanks to the havoc being wreaked by the Type 93 submarines. Most managed to deliver their payloads. In a matter of hours, China's sneak attack destroyed the majority of the US military presence in Japan. War is official. Xi Jinping has struck the first blow. Day 2. President Joe Biden is in a state of incredulous shock. China's movements had been no secret to him. He knew the country was amassing some of its submarines in the East China Sea and had received reports about the Fujian aircraft carrier in the area. But he and his intelligence officials believed that Japan would be the target. Technically, it was, but he hadn't anticipated that China's attack would focus so heavily on America's Okinawa bases. This wasn't solely an attack on Japan. In fact, Japan was just collateral damage to China in their goal of inflicting a devastating blow on the United States. After a day filled with press briefings and reports from his military officials, Biden knew that he had an ace up his sleeve that Xi Jinping hadn't considered: Article 5 of the NATO Founding Treaty. Article 5 states that if any member of NATO is the victim of an armed attack, every other member of the alliance will consider this attack as an act of violence committed against all of its members. In response, They will take actions they deem necessary to assist the NATO ally that's been attacked. It's a collective defense initiative designed to ward off any countries that are foolish enough to start a war with a NATO member. It's clear to Biden that China's strike was intended to hurt the U.S. It's an act of violence, as clear as day. Calls are made. All NATO decisions are reached following a discussion and consultation with all member nations. This process ends with everyone agreeing on a common stance, which shapes how NATO deals with the China situation. Biden has spent the last few hours of the day engaged in one of those consultations with the leaders of NATO's other 30 member countries. He makes his case. The United States is the strongest member nation. Leaving it to fight a war against China alone would significantly weaken the U.S., hurting NATO in the process. NATO's members agree. They see through any argument that Xi makes about his attack intended to target Japan, and they reach a consensus. An attack on the United States is an attack on all other 30 members. Day 3. Xi Jinping receives word about the NATO consensus. He anticipated this. He knew that the U.S. would go running to its allies, and this consensus just proves what he's always said. NATO is nothing more than a puppet of the U.S. No matter. The majority of NATO's members simply aren't strong enough to pose a threat to China's rapidly growing army. Yes, the UK, France, and Germany can all cause problems. Same goes for Poland, which has established one of Europe's strongest militaries over the last decade or so. But she also knows that many of those NATO members, especially those in Europe, are at a distinct disadvantage. War is already raging in Ukraine, with several NATO members having already committed billions of dollars, as well as huge amounts of equipment, to the Ukrainian war effort. Russia is still a problem for those European members. If they withdraw support for Ukraine, they essentially hand the war over to Putin, expanding Russian influence in Europe. Poland can't afford that. No European country can. Even if NATO dedicates troops to help the US, it won't be able to offer its full support. And even if it could, most NATO nations have a really rough time getting to China, so it could attack its western borders. Moving through Russia isn't an option for obvious reasons, and it's unlikely that the string of nations that make up the Middle East are going to cooperate and allow NATO troops through, especially Iran. If NATO were to try to attack by making its way through Asia, it would need to start wars with the likes of Iran and Russia directly. Not an option. So any attack would be naval and would have to come from America's western borders or be executed by sailing around Africa, past India, and up to China, giving Xi plenty of time to launch counterattacks. While NATO develops a plan, Xi has more attacks to launch. Next on the agenda are South Korea's 73 American bases and what remains of the 120 bases in Japan. The U.S. has mobilized the naval assets in those bases, but they're no match for China's combined naval and air forces. For now, Xi can wreak devastation while keeping his troops on Chinese soil. If NATO wants to win this war, it will need to find a way in. Day 4. The U.S. has accepted that sacrificing many of its bases in South Korea and Japan is an inevitability. At the very least, the sacrifice buys NATO time, with the added benefit of incentivizing Japan and South Korea to join in the fight. So far, neither nation has officially declared war on China because they're wary of Beijing's nuclear threat. Xi Jinping has over 400 nukes at his disposal, according to the Arms Control Association, with Japan and South Korea having a combined total of 0. They must wait for NATO forces to launch their attack before joining in. As Xi attacks the bases in Japan and South Korea, NATO comes up with a plan. Use Australia as a base of operations to enable NATO forces to attack China from the south. America already has 7 bases set up in the country, housing over 1,000 troops. Britain's strong relationship with the Aussies will also prove advantageous, as it has 4 bases set up in the country. All that's left is to get Australian approval. NATO leadership has been speaking to Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Its argument is simple. China has started its march toward world domination. By taking out the U.S. first, it hopes to weaken the Western forces that could prevent it from tipping the global geopolitical scales. And with the U.S. out of the way, who does Albanese think China will target next? Japan? South Korea? Australia? The argument is already convincing, but NATO can also highlight that it and Australia already have deep ties. Though Australia isn't an official member, it has worked with NATO in Afghanistan. It provided troops from the Australian Defence Force, or ADF, to work alongside NATO's International Security Assistance Force during the Afghanistan conflict. Plus, NATO and Australia have signed several agreements related to defense building, and Australia is one of NATO's Enhanced Opportunity Partners. It's a member of NATO in all but name, the organization argues, and it will need help to protect itself against the looming Chinese threat. Albanese agrees.
NATO spends the day mobilizing naval assets. The United States mobilizes its Cyclone-class patrol ships along its west coast. Any Chinese attack would have to come through there, because China attempting to attack via the Atlantic would open up its naval assets to assaults by NATO's many European members. With the Cyclone-class ships mobilized, the U.S. deploys Avenger-class mine countermeasure ships, which will be vital in clearing the East China Sea of mines, as well as the majority of its fleet of 40 Los Angeles-class submarines. A handful remain stationed in the Pacific to guard against Chinese vessels. They're accompanied by Freedom-class littoral combat ships, which will sit off of Australia's coast to guard it against Chinese attacks, as well as ships carrying thousands of American soldiers. Britain sends a fleet as well. Assault ships, frigates, and destroyers start making their way to Australia, as does the HMS Bangor Minehunter. The HMS Queen Elizabeth, an enormous aircraft carrier, also leaves British waters on a long journey to Australia. Other NATO nations make their own contributions. France sends several of its frigates, corvettes, and Le Triomphant-class ballistic missile submarines. Canada joins the United States in deploying ships to defend its and America's western borders. As for NATO's other members, they're tasked with keeping Ukraine funded to keep the Russians at bay. After all, Russian success in Ukraine provides Putin with an opportunity to lend extensive support to China, should he choose to do so. Even a depleted Russia would be a dangerous ally. So NATO's other European members must continue supplying Ukraine with money and equipment to drag that war on even longer. Day 5. NATO's collaboration with Australia isn't unexpected. Xi sits in his office to contemplate his next move. An attack on Australia now could weaken it ahead of the arrival of NATO's troops, but he doesn't want to risk a ground-based assault. Plus, Australia has mobilized its navy into a defensive formation within the country's northern borders. That navy doesn't compare to China's in sheer numbers. Xi knows he has over 700 vessels compared to Australia's 43. He could attack now and use the days it'll take for NATO forces to arrive in Australia to overwhelm the country. But he has another problem. Japan and South Korea have started mobilizing. Buoyed by the news that NATO is on its way, both have mobilized their navies into defensive postures. Japan's fleet of 155 vessels doesn't compare with China's, neither does South Korea's fleet of 200. But combined, they represent a serious problem to which Xi has to divert at least half of his naval resources. Xi maintains a strong naval presence in the East China Sea and in the Sea of Japan, encouraging skirmishes with the Japanese and South Korean navies. He deploys the Liaoning and the Shandong, China's 2 aircraft carriers, to handle Australia's ships. They bring 57 Shenyang J-15 fighters into the South China Sea and the Philippine Sea. Days 6 to 10. What follows is several days of attempted strikes against Australian naval vessels. Xi launches wave after wave of J-15s from his aircraft carriers, each equipped with 23 or 30mm cannons, along with PL-7, PL-8, PL-9, and PL-12 cruise missiles. Any of these planes that get into range of an Australian ship is able to drop various bombs, including guided ones to scupper the Australian Navy. But Australia isn't defenseless in the air. Even though Australia doesn't have any aircraft carriers, it does have 24 fighter jets. That might not seem like much compared to China's 1,207 fighters, but China's capabilities are limited to the 56 J-15s on its aircraft carriers. While it's still an uneven matchup, Australian jets can fly from their home territory, carry out bombing runs, and engage China's J-15s in aerial combat to protect part of their fleet. Additionally, American and British troops and their ships and planes are also involved, providing extra support for Australia's defense efforts. The Aussies just need to hold out for reinforcements. NATO is on its way. Ground troops are being flown in daily, preparing for an all-out assault from Australia. It'll take at least another 5 days for America's fleet of Los Angeles-class submarines to arrive, which will be enough to scare away China's aircraft carriers. Their loadouts of Tomahawk missiles and Mark 48 torpedoes are enough to cause serious damage to China's aircraft carriers, if not sink them outright. And China can only sustain its aerial assault for a few days before its carriers need to return to port. The rest of NATO's naval forces will come in the following days, shoring up Australian defenses before getting ready to launch a counterattack of their own. Day 20. NATO forces have arrived in Australia. US, British, and French ships and submarines are docked and ready to take the fight through the South China Sea and into the East China Sea. Xi Jinping expects NATO to start landing troops in China, or at least attempting to do so, where his massive ground forces will be able to fight them off. It's a filtering effect. Some get through and engage in ground warfare, with China's superior numbers winning the day.
Meanwhile, China uses its coastal navy to delay landing ships and ideally keep the filter effect going. But that's not what happens. Over the next few days, NATO's naval forces do little to make real inroads through the Chinese seas. Instead, they're organizing into defensive formations, essentially creating a barrier between China and Australia. Reinforcements arrive in Japan too, with NATO's combined naval forces essentially pinning China into the South and East China Seas. That was unexpected. She expected his provocation to push NATO into attacking on Chinese soil. Why isn't that happening? He racks his brain trying to find an answer and comes up empty. He tries launching naval attacks against the barricade, but he's met with opposition that's strong enough to keep his ships penned in. And he quickly realizes that his massive navy, primarily made up of smaller ships, doesn't have the sheer tonnage required to compete with combined NATO, Australian, South Korean, and Japanese forces. Days 21 to 30. NATO's plan is going perfectly. Sending such a huge fleet to Australia under the auspices of using it as a base of operations to launch an attack has tricked Xi Jinping. That was never the plan. Instead, Australia bravely held the fort while waiting for NATO forces to arrive, and now has a much stronger defense against Chinese aggression. Even China's spies in Australia reported that a counterattack was imminent. In the meantime, Japan, the US, and Canada have cooperated to create defenses across the Pacific Ocean. Chinese ships won't be able to make it past their blockade toward the United States without being detected, meaning a ground war on American soil isn't a possibility. The strategy of tying up Russia in Ukraine has also worked well. NATO continues to funnel funds and equipment to Zelensky, with Russia growing increasingly wary of making further provocations in the European theater. Poland and Germany in particular have spoken in the media about how they'll be forced to respond if Putin allows China to send its troops through Russia and into the European mainland. She was relying on Russia to provide safe passage so he could launch an assault into Europe. That isn't going to happen anymore unless China can commit forces to Russia's effort in Ukraine. And it can't. It's already stretching itself, attempting to break through NATO's new barricade. She is pinned in, and the worst is coming. Days 31 to 40. With a barricade established around Australia, NATO turns its attention to other measures. China's economy relies massively on maritime trade, as highlighted by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. An enormous 52.1% of the country's gross domestic product is seaborne, with around 60% of its oil being purchased from international sources. Of that 60%, the vast majority, 90%, arrives by seaborne channels. Without that imported oil, China will start to collapse internally. It's massively reliant on that oil for its energy sector, presenting an opportunity to NATO. Now NATO knows it can't blockade every channel leading into China. The Strait of Hormuz, for example, is controlled primarily by Iran, and NATO won't be able to convince the Iranians to support it. After all, that country is as anti-West as China and would likely be an ally in this conflict. However, it can cut off other routes. At Africa's southern tip, patrols around the Cape of Good Hope could slow down commercial vessels bringing oil to China. Same goes for the Malacca and Singapore Straits. NATO has smartly cultivated strong relationships with the countries that control those straits: Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. A bilateral meeting between NATO's Minister of Defense and Indonesian representatives took place in October 2023, with the organization also conducting visits to Singapore via its Science and Technology Committee since at least May 2019. Malaysia is an outlier in that it doesn't have such a direct relationship with NATO. It could be argued that the country is more of an ally to China than it is to NATO. But at the very least, NATO can sow seeds of discontent between the three nations controlling the Malacca and Singapore Straits to slow down the passage of oil through them. And through it all, NATO will force its presence into the South and East China Seas. Even oil that makes it through the various routes that lead into China must navigate these seas. A multi-level blockade can slow down or even prevent many of the ships carrying exports out of China, as well as imports and oil into the country. NATO's strategy becomes clear. It's going to hit Beijing in the purse strings, because it knows that China's fleet can't match the tonnage or firepower of the combined NATO naval forces. Day 41. Xi Jinping is panicking. Reports are already coming in that commercial ships are being delayed, with NATO's naval blockade making it incredibly difficult for ships to make it into China's ports. Even those that do are coming in at such a slow rate that they won't be able to sustain China commercially or in terms of its energy needs. Then comes more bad economic news. With its naval blockade established, NATO's member countries simultaneously announced sanctions against China. Japan, South Korea and Australia follow suit. Economic blow after economic blow comes reeling in. The United States places severe limits on Chinese imports, making a massive dent in the $562.9 billion China earns from sending goods to the U.S. annually. In the UK, similar sanctions take a slice out of the near $80 billion of imports the country typically buys annually. Germany, Poland, France, Canada, every NATO nation follows suit to cut off the money flow into China. They also place sanctions on their exports, limiting what China can receive even further alongside the naval blockade. This is turning into a disaster for Xi Jinping. He expected his war against the U.S. to draw in South Korea and Japan. After all, he attacked bases in both countries directly. He even expected NATO to join the war, though he thought he was safe from many of the countries in the organization due to their European positioning. But he didn't expect a blockade, and there's nothing he can do about it. For as large as his navy may be, it's mostly offshore patrol vessels, a little over 125 of them, all of which are useless against the NATO blockade. They have no chance of breaking through. The fleet still has 72 submarines and 71 corvettes, but the combined NATO forces easily match that. Its frigates and destroyers are also rendered ineffective as they come up against similar NATO-led ships. Xi is fighting to a standstill in the waters that surround his country, with every passing day creating more monetary and resource-related pressure. Still, he has one more trick up his sleeve. 3, actually. Day 42. The CSS-4 Mod 3, the DF-41, and the CSS-10 Mod 2. All three are intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, that have enough range to reach the United States and continental Europe. The CSS-4 Mod 3 has the furthest reach of the three, capable of traveling a little over 8,000 miles. The other two aren't far behind in range, coming in at nearly 7,500 miles for the DF-41 and a touch under 7,000 miles in the case of the CSS-10 Mod 2. Los Angeles is 6,265 miles away from Beijing, making a nuclear strike with any of those missiles possible. Going the other way, Munich is about 4,800 miles away, Paris 5,102 miles, and London is about that same distance. If he wanted to, she could launch nukes to hit all three now. She knows such a launch would provoke a response from every nuclear-ready nation in NATO. That includes the UK, France, and the United States, all of which have submarines capable of launching their own nukes. China can do little to guard itself against those subs. Its own submarines are either destroyed, isolated in far-flung waters, or stuck in the South and East China Seas. On top of all that, he simply can't match NATO's combined nuclear might. Despite its massive nuclear modernization investment, China only has around 410 nukes. That's more than France and the UK, which have 290 and 225 respectively, but it's less than a third the number of the US. And when you combine American nukes with French and British ones, China would face a potential barrage of over 2,000 missiles, compared to the 410 it can unleash. His government can't afford to weather the impact that a loss to NATO would have on its credibility. China has positioned itself as the alternative to America's geopolitical dominance for years. Surrendering to NATO now would overshadow everything Xi Jinping has achieved over the last decade. He would be ousted in a heartbeat. And even if China accepted defeat, odds are that it wouldn't stay down for long. Somebody else would replace him, with the nationalism he's worked so hard to foster being the impetus for a rebuild that could lead to future conflict. It's better to strike now, unless a compromise can be reached. Day 43. A video conference is taking place. Present are Xi Jinping, Joe Biden, the UK's Rishi Sunak, France's Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and every other head of state that leads a NATO country. During this meeting, Xi proposes a truce. The essence is that the war between China and NATO should end, with neither side conceding defeat. Both will essentially engage in an extended ceasefire. China would cease attacks in Japan and South Korea, leaving the US to build its shattered bases. In return, NATO opens the blockade to open trade back up. If those terms aren't agreeable, Xi says, we have certain weapons that can reach major cities in every single NATO nation. It's a bold gambit. Xi Jinping hopes that the threat of mutually assured destruction can put an end to the war he started, while allowing him to save face. He'll be able to spin this in his favor. China would have easily crushed the US, he could say. The only reason it didn't was because of NATO and America's allies in the Indo-Pacific. The NATO leaders mull the proposal over. China's nuclear threat is very real, but they know that it presents an even more dangerous threat to Beijing. On top of that, reports are leaking out that China's missiles may not be as reliable as they need to be in order to make this threat credible. Biden starts speaking. He points out that Xi knows, as well as all the other NATO members, that his nuclear threats can be met with threats that exceed his own. He also highlights the purge that Xi conducted toward the end of 2023 and the reports that some of China's missiles are filled with water rather than fuel. Biden twists the knife. Is Xi Jinping confident that his nuclear missiles can travel as far as he claims? Has the rampant corruption in China's military impacted its ability to conduct a successful nuclear strike? Xi doesn't answer. He believes he can conduct his strike even if some of his missiles are compromised, but he can't know for certain. The meeting ends with NATO's leaders stating they'll communicate their decision the next day. Day 44. Discussions have raged within NATO for nearly 24 hours. Some nations argue that the threat of Chinese nuclear strikes is enough to accept Xi Jinping's proposal. The argument is especially loud from the many members who can't launch nuclear weapons of their own. A minority argues for calling Xi's bluff. They argue that China's president knows that he can't win a nuclear standoff and that any launch from Beijing would be met in kind by launches from the US, UK, and France. Moreover, Xi would have to deal with almost every country in the world turning against him, as he shows himself to be the aggressor he always claimed he wasn't. He's already done that with his attacks on American bases. Now he's just trying to save face. A consensus is reached. NATO decides to push for a truce, though one that sees China giving up far more than it had hoped. Financially, it'll have to help Japan, South Korea, and Australia rebuild after the attacks it waged against them in the name of its war against the US and NATO. She will also have to agree to a stronger oversight of its nuclear program, both by NATO and the United Nations, becoming more transparent about its military ambitions in the process. Only then will NATO accept a truce that sees it open up its naval blockade. The message is delivered, and Xi Jinping is left with a choice he doesn't want to make. Launch Chinese nuclear weapons knowing that this action will result in his country's annihilation, or accept NATO's offer, and likely the end of his presidency with it, costing China years of careful strengthening in the process. Which choice will he make? Do you think China will end its war with NATO in a blaze of hellfire unleashed by scores of nuclear weapons? Or will NATO and China reach a compromise that ends the war while establishing that NATO's collective defense works? In the 1984 film Red Dawn, the beleaguered Wolverines, teen partisans defending the middle of America against a Soviet and Cuban invasion, ask a downed U.S. fighter pilot, played by Powers Booth, what started the war. His answer? The two toughest kids on the block, I guess. Sooner or later, they're gonna fight. That's the way many analysts see the current situation between the United States and its allies, primarily NATO, and China and its main military ally, Russia. With all the military spending on both sides, it only seems inevitable that they will eventually use the power they've built up to forward their global agendas. The current situation between the authoritarian East and liberal West has not been this tense in about half a century. The invasion of Ukraine has brought NATO and the United States into as close to an all-out hot war with Russia as we've seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But with that previous series of events cooled off before shots fired, the Ukrainian war has seen hundreds of thousands of casualties. Russia feels that many of the deaths on their side are due to the military and economic aid sent by NATO and the US to Ukraine. Putin and his political henchmen have repeatedly threatened NATO with nuclear weapons if they feel the existence of their country is threatened any more than it already is. Matters weren't made any better when Great Britain almost had one of its RC-135 reconnaissance planes shot down in September 2022, which would have raised tensions even more. There was another close call in November of 2022 when an errant Ukrainian air defense missile missed its intended target, another Russian missile barrage indiscriminately targeting Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, and landed in neighboring Poland, killing 2 people. NATO has a very specific section of its agreement called Article 5, which states that any attack on a member nation is an attack on all of NATO. For a moment, talks of all-out war between Russia and NATO filled the blogosphere. Russian officials have sought to paint NATO as aggressors in the war, continually claiming that the poor little Russia was directly fighting against the massive enemy of NATO, while the US and its allies have said they are supporting Ukraine's defense with military aid and unspecified intelligence sharing, but not with boots on the ground. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, China continues to make threatening gestures toward Taiwan, including recent armed jet intrusions of Taiwanese airspace following Speaker Pelosi's trip to the island in 2022, and then Speaker McCarthy's trip in 2023.
Following the more recent April trip, China effectively closed Taiwan's airspace with waves of fighter jets and for the first time made it seem like they were able to interdict any U.S. support from the east of the island. There is even talk that China might begin to require ships transiting the Taiwan Strait to undergo boarding and searching, which Taiwan says they will vigorously oppose. Are we close to a hot war? First off, let's make one thing clear. The U.S. and China are not on the verge of war. On March 31, 2023, General Mark Milley, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, "I don't think at this point I would put the possibility of imminent war in the likely category, and I think that the rhetoric itself can overheat the environment." However, General Milley did admit that it is possible that you could have an incident or some other trigger event that could lead to uncontrolled escalation, so it's not impossible. That incident would most likely evolve around an attempted Chinese invasion of Taiwan. President Xi has publicly stated that he wants the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, to be prepared to take Taiwan by force as early as 2027, so that risk clearly does exist. Let's take a look at the two main theaters of such a potential war. NATO and the European elements of the United States' forces arrayed against Russia, and the U.S. forces in the Pacific, mostly naval forces, against the might of the Chinese Army and Navy. Of course, such a comparison will not include the opposing nuclear forces. Any of the combatants have enough warheads to turn vast swaths of the world into unlivable nuclear wasteland. For the purposes of this comparison, we will hope that all sides would agree not to resort to such catastrophic weapons. The opposing military strengths in Europe. Before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, most of the world perceived Russia as the second most powerful military in the world. They had massive numbers of tanks and artillery, their air force was seen as a peer with the American Air Force, and their navy was capable and feared, even if it didn't have comparable numbers to the US Navy. Russia's military fiasco in Ukraine has proven their tanks are outdated and poorly designed. Their logistics vanish once they leave their rail network, and their air force has been fragile enough that they don't dare fly over Ukrainian territory for fear of being shot down. The only two legs of their military that remain unbowed by these defeats are its artillery, still numerous, though notably inaccurate, and its nuclear forces, which remain unused and still unproven. As of April 2023, the widely respected research organization Oryx has documented and confirmed an astounding 10,000 vehicle losses by the Russian armed forces, including over 1,900 main battle tanks, half of what it reportedly had pre-invasion, along with 830 armored fighting vehicles, 2,200 infantry fighting vehicles, 800 pieces of artillery, 79 aircraft, 81 helicopters, and 12 surface vessels, including the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Slava-class guided missile cruiser Moskva. This is in addition to an estimated 200,000 Russian military casualties, with anything between 45,000 to 50,000 killed in action. These numbers are incredibly high from just over a year of fighting, and are far greater even than what Russia suffered in its 10-year losing war in Afghanistan. The losses are so high that in early 2023, Russia began returning 75-year-old T-54-55s into service, the equivalent of the U.S. using Korean War-era M47s. The Russia also lost a reported 1,500 officers, including 160 top-level generals and colonels, and it's clear the once-feared Russian military is a shell of its former self. Standing opposite the vastly depleted and shaken Russian military is NATO, now more united and stronger than at any time in its 74-year history. With Finland's admission into NATO in April of 2023 as its 31st signatory nation, the organization can now boast a combined troop strength of just over 3.5 million soldiers, airmen, and sailors. That includes, however, the US and its 1.4 million strong standing army, not all of which would be fighting in Europe, and Turkey's 425,000, not the most committed of NATO's members. That means the rest of NATO's 29 members contribute only 1.7 million troops total. France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Poland, and Italy each have 160,000 or more active personnel, while other countries have smaller forces to rely on. It must be stated, though, NATO considers itself a defensive organization. How involved they'd be beyond their own borders is anyone's guess. It's important to note that the current war in Ukraine has shown that the NATO members, mostly led by Poland and the US, are willing to supply lethal aid from missiles to artillery to tanks and fighter jets to a non-signatory nation whose defense is of a vital interest to nearby NATO members. Since Russia launched its invasion in February of 2022, NATO members have increased both their military budgets and pledged a greater amount of military spending per capita. They've also benefited from sending Ukraine their Soviet-era tanks and fighter jets, which have been replaced with upgraded models, many of them being state-of-the-art models from other member nations, like the US's F-35 stealth fighter and M1A2 Abrams tanks.
NATO can also count on around 1,500 Leopard 2s and about 2,500 M1 Abrams main battle tanks, the majority of which are M1A2s, with the rest being the earlier M1A1s, with an additional 800 or so British Challenger 2s and French Leclerc and Arietes. And while the number of aircraft on both the NATO and Russian sides appear about equal, NATO forces employ more 4th and 5th generation fighters like the F-35 and the improved and updated versions of the F-16. While Russia is still reliant on more outdated MiG-29s introduced in 1982, MiG-31s introduced in 1981, and the Su-27s introduced in 1985. These three plane types alone account for more than 750 of their total 1,100 available pre-invasion fighter aircraft, a disproportionate number of outdated and non-modernized platforms. And as has been seen in Ukraine, many of these aircraft have not been maintained sufficiently in order for them to be combat-ready anytime soon. It's clear that a war between only the European forces of NATO and the struggling military of Russia would be a one-sided affair. But how would China fare against a mostly US force? The opposing forces in the Pacific. China, it should be obvious, has not suffered from an equivalent loss of military strength as Russia has over the past year. In fact, the modernization and expansion of its military has been impressive and has caused its neighbors like Japan, Australia, India, and the Philippines to increase their own military expenditures. Yet China is still missing major components that will allow it to go toe-to-toe with the US Navy. These missing elements suggest China would be better off waiting at least 5 years, and possibly as much as 10 years, before it initiates an open military confrontation with the West. For example, the People's Liberation Army Navy, the Plan, currently operates 25 of its modern 10,000-ton Type 52D destroyers, with its own version of the Aegis-type radar system, along with 8 of the more advanced 13,000-ton Type 55A destroyers, along with 6 of the earlier 7,000-ton Type 52C ships. There are up to 12 additional destroyers currently under construction. But while these ships are designed specifically for missile and aircraft defenses, they've yet to deploy with the planned HQ-26 medium-range ship-to-air missile system, which was based on the Russian 9K-37 Buk, first developed in 1972. This new missile system is reportedly equivalent to the US SM-3 missile used by the Aegis ballistic missile defense system and was expected to be able to engage short and medium-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and both manned and unmanned aircraft out to 400 kilometers. However, this capability is expected to be implemented around a year or two from first deployment and will be even longer before it's deployed fleet-wide. Until then, China's missile defense destroyers like the Type 52 and 55 will have to make do with the upgraded HQ-16B with a reported maximum range of only 70 kilometers, a system that dates from 2011. The biggest weakness in the plan, of course, is its aircraft carrier fleet. They currently operate 3 carriers, the oldest being a 90s-era Ukrainian-built Russian-designed ship named the Liaoning with its ski jump ramp, which is also a staple of its second carrier, the Type 002 Shandong. The Liaoning isn't really considered a frontline carrier and is relegated to the role of training carrier. Its third carrier, the Fujian, currently being fitted out, is equipped with advanced electromagnetic catapults, similar to those on the U.S. supercarrier USS Gerald R. Ford. Some say copied directly from it. But that means the plan will have to train its carrier pilots on 2 types of takeoffs, and they'll need 2 different types of carrier planes to operate on those carriers. Its current training model, the JL-9G, a single-engine twin-seat aircraft first deployed in 2011, can't be used to duplicate emergency landings on any of its current carriers because it's too weak to take the continual pounding of carrier landings, and it's too underpowered to immediately take off in case of a missed landing. That leaves only simulated takeoffs and landings on ground-based mock-ups. This inability to field a true carrier trainer has led to a huge deficit in trained carrier pilots. The problem with the planned trainer is just the opposite of its carrier combat aircraft, the J-15 Flying Shark, which was mocked by Russia for trying to be a back-engineered version of a Su-33 prototype, the T-10K3, which they bought from Ukraine back in 2001. At a reported 17.5 tons, its upgraded version is now thought to be the world's heaviest carrier-borne fighter. In comparison, the US Navy's FA-18 weighs only 14.5 tons. The J-15 suffers from either having to carry less than optimal fuel, giving it less range, or less armament, giving it less lethality if it intends to take off from the 2 ski jump-equipped carriers. It has since been nicknamed the Flopping Fish by the normally reserved Chinese press for its underwhelming performance. China's begun deployment of the Chengdu J-20, somewhat comparable to the US's F-22 stealth fighter, and have produced around 200 of them, but this aircraft cannot be adapted to carriers and remains a standard land-based air superiority fighter. China hopes to make up the difference in carrier forces with hypersonic missiles, though their reliability and readiness is still under discussion.
At present, there's speculation but no confirmation that China is building a fourth carrier, though at least one recent satellite image suggests a fourth might be under construction. But the plan doesn't have enough carrier pilots for its two current frontline carriers, let alone a fourth. In comparison, the U.S. currently operates 11 carrier strike groups, each of which is comprised of one of its nuclear propulsion Nimitz or Ford-class supercarriers able to field 70 to 80 aircraft, one or two Ticonderoga-class Aegis-guided missile cruisers for air defense and coordination, two LAMPS-capable warships focusing on anti-submarine and surface warfare, and 2 to 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers. Each strike group is accompanied by assorted logistics and support ships and an undisclosed number of nuclear-powered attack submarines, usually 1 or 2, that coordinate with each strike group. The new Ford-class supercarriers currently in use by the U.S. Navy are undoubtedly the most powerful warships ever produced, with 1 in service and 4 more planned or currently under construction to be delivered between 2024 and 2034. There are literally no carrier groups of such lethality in any navy in the world, though the British and French navies do have their own carrier battle groups with somewhat comparable strengths. The U.S. also deploys several amphibious-ready groups built around the Wasp-class amphibious assault ships, in essence a small carrier, which can handle 6 fighters like the F-35 Lightning II and up to 24 helicopters like the Cobra gunship and the VF-22 Osprey transport vehicles. The amphibious-ready groups also include a landing platform dock ship (LPD) from the San Antonio class, capable of deploying up to 600 troops and 14 amphibious assault vehicles, and a landing ship dock (LSD) like the Harper's Ferry class and the Whidbey Island class landing ships, which can load and unload conventional landing craft and helicopters. These amphibious-ready groups can also launch dozens of autonomous drones like the X-47B. Normally 2 to 3 ARGs are forward deployed, 1 in the Mediterranean Sea or the Persian Gulf/Indian Ocean region, and 1 or 2 in the Western Pacific Ocean area. Currently, 1 ARG is based out of Sasebo and Okinawa, Japan. The ARGs are usually attached to a carrier strike group which provides protection for them from both land and sea-based attacks. The U.S. can also count on 26 Los Angeles-class, 3 Seawolf-class, and 21 Virginia-class nuclear-powered attack submarines, as well as dozens of ballistic missile submarines, each with ICBM-capable launch tubes. On the other hand, the plan operates 6 Shang-class nuclear submarines and 40 older diesel-electric submarines of much lower capability. Many experts point to the plan's superiority in total numbers of ships over the U.S. Navy, 340 to 300, but we must consider that the plan's numbers include 150 patrol craft, which are more equivalent to the U.S. Coast Guard's cutters, designed for coastal engagements only, and not really capable of the kind of blue water combat the main naval units would engage in. In addition, while the U.S. Navy appears perfectly capable of handling the current plan on its own, any shooting war will likely involve other countries that are either wary of or outright opposed to Chinese naval power projection, including Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, and India. Following continued efforts by China to claim the entire South China Sea as their own personal swimming pool, each of these countries has begun to beef up their own naval might. Japan, for instance, is building 2 of the largest destroyers in the world. At 20,000 tons, they dwarf even the U.S.'s 16,000-ton Zumwalt destroyers. These will complement and support Japan's 2 new Izumo and Kaga carriers, converted from previous helicopter destroyers, and will operate the F-35B Joint Strike Fighter. Once complete, the 2 carriers will be Japan's first since the Second World War. Along with Japan's increasing naval might, Australia has entered into a long-term agreement with the U.S. and Great Britain to build a fleet of state-of-the-art nuclear-powered attack submarines. India has also increased its own naval strength, while the country is still aching from violent confrontations instigated by China along its northern Himalayan border. China's true Achilles heel. And that brings up the most crucial component of any possible shooting war involving China: the fact that the country must import 70 to 75% of all their oil and natural gas through a long naval route from the Baltic through the Atlantic and past Africa, India, and Indonesia. If the U.S. or its Pacific allies wanted to interdict the flow of petroleum to China, and such a lengthy supply chain would be impossible for China to protect, then China would be looking at a 3-month delay before its countrywide truck transport system would shut down due to a lack of fuel, and 6 months before it ran out of the necessary components for the production of fertilizers, which its farmers desperately need. Their economy would collapse within a year, and massive famine would break out even if they did manage to hold off the superior U.S. Navy. This dramatic and inevitable failure of their economy and the catastrophic famine that would follow might be the main reason why China isn't looking to launch a full-scale war anytime soon. Not only is it a heavy importer of raw petroleum, it's also the world's largest importer of food. Between 2000 and 2020, the country's food self-sufficiency ratio decreased from 93.6% to 65.8%. China's leaders know that if it cannot win a war outright in a very short period of a few months, and the vast capabilities of the US Navy, let alone its numerous Pacific allies, suggest that this just isn't a reliable possibility, then they are dooming their country to losing their position as the second most powerful economy in the world, with a disastrous famine soon to follow. The lessons of the Ukraine war are also a stark reminder that a determined, well-equipped country, no matter how small, can resist an invader far more easily with today's advanced technological weapons. And while Ukraine has done a phenomenal job in gaining that capability in a mere 8 years since the first Russian invasion of 2014, Taiwan has been preparing itself for a Chinese invasion for more than 70 years. They're also a much more technologically capable nation and have a large 80-mile moat of an ocean that China would have to navigate in case of an invasion. This would not be an easy cross-border incursion that Russia attempted and failed, but it would require dozens of landing craft, easy targets for missiles, and waiting artillery. The fragility of a Russia-China alliance. In addition to logistical problems of overcoming the US Navy and the watery moat around Taiwan, China faces another hurdle: the weakness of any long-term alliance with Russia. An alliance that would merely be a castle built upon sand. Any full-scale war short of a nuclear engagement would find Russia's military virtually destroyed within the first few weeks of the conflict's launch, leaving China virtually alone. The Ukrainian invasion has spotlighted why Russia is nowhere near the military peer to the US, China, or even NATO that people thought it was. As previously mentioned, the Russian armed forces have lost over 10,000 military vehicles, including upwards of 1,900 main battle tanks, along with around 200,000 troops. The main reason they threaten the West so often with nuclear weapons is because they know they never stand a chance against the combined forces of NATO, which have more advanced equipment and better trained troops, and now might actually hold a numerical advantage as well. There are multiple reasons for the failure of the Russian military. First and foremost is the endemic corruption that riddles every layer of the Russian government, including the military. There are estimates that corruption has cost from 25 to 30% of Russia's total annual GDP, and the sanctions Russia has endured since the start of the war has caused a massive drain of its remaining economy. Not only is Russia's economy collapsing due to the surprisingly efficient Western sanctions, but that smaller economy's spending on its military is actually much less than the projected numbers. The sanctions have also shrunk the Russian economy to the size of Italy, and now puts it behind the individual states of California, Texas, or New York. Russia's nominal $1.4 trillion GDP is minuscule when compared to the EU's combined economic strength of about $15.28 trillion. Add the US and the EU's GDP together, you get about $35 trillion, more than 40% of the total world GDP. Russia will simply never be able to outspend the EU and its NATO counterpart, much less the US and EU combined. Second, Russia has never had a coherent NCO training program. Russia has lost at least 150 officers of colonel rank and above simply because their orders have to be passed almost directly from the leadership to the frontline troops. The members of NATO, the US, and even China understand that the sergeants and other NCOs have to have the independent authority to assess the war from the front lines and make immediate and effective changes in response. Russia has never had that level of independence, which leads their military to dogmatic, inflexible attacks that usually require masses of tanks, waves of infantry, and massive artillery bombardments, none of which are effective in a modern battlefield environment that is overwatched by drones, surveillance satellites, and reconnaissance planes. Third, Russia has never had the ability to manage their logistics at any distance from their rail network. The ignominious 40-mile-long traffic jam north of Kyiv from late February to March of 2022 was one glaring example of how their military cannot perform the simple task of keeping their tanks and transports full of fuel and moving. This lack of logistics has been further exacerbated by the introduction of HIMARS long-range rocket artillery systems, which can hit targets over 50 miles away, and newer smart ammunition including ground-launched small-diameter bombs, GLSDB, which can hit targets 93 miles away. These have been used to great success by the Ukrainian forces against Russian depots that have often been placed too close to the front, mostly due to their lack of logistical transport capabilities. The inherent weakness of an unequal partnership. There are additional signs that China is aware of Russia's much weaker role in any potential alliance and has been capitalizing on this inequality for some time now. At first, it was the Soviet Union that held a predominant role in any bilateral negotiations, allowing them to bully China into accepting unequal agreements. Things got so bad that the two countries almost launched a major war over a border dispute in 1969, one of several border disputes between the two countries since the 1920s. But Russia eventually decided it was better to arm the Chinese government in order to have an ally against the West. China, however, decided on its own that it'd be better to copy and/or steal whatever they could get, rather than pay the full price for products coming from the Soviet Union. Starting in the 1990s, China has openly copied or stolen Russian technology, leading at times to Russia having to swallow their pride as China sold knockoffs of their own frontline equipment. For example, in 1996, China debuted the J-11 aircraft, the first fighter made after the fall of the Soviet Union to feature significant Russian input. At first, it was an officially licensed Chinese-made copy of the Russian Su-27 multi-role fighter, whose sales were welcomed by the cash-poor post-Soviet state. Before long, however, China canceled their agreement and began producing the aircraft independently, eventually building over 400 unauthorized J-11s, equaling an economic loss to the USSR of more than $10 billion. Russia continues to sell its best or almost best military gear to China, even though they know the technology is likely to be copied, reducing what little technological superiority Russia still maintains over China. The policy dilemma has been compounded by the post-Ukraine effect on Russia's struggling manufacturing sector, which has left the shrinking Russian economy increasingly reliant on China's much larger economic base, further eroding any remaining compatibility in their relationship. More recently, President Xi has tried to bring China to the forefront in worldwide diplomacy. So when the UN held a vote to condemn the Russian invasion, China surprisingly abstained from the 141-5 vote to condemn the invasion, and in fact was a key leader of 34 other countries who also abstained. This was the first time that China had a chance to publicly support their, quote, partner, and they openly refused. This hands-off approach demonstrates China's desire to maintain its currently neutral stance regarding the Ukraine war, in hopes of trying to establish Beijing's bid for global leadership. But they can't do that if they supplied lethal aid to Russia, so they refuse to supply such support, despite Putin's pleas to the contrary. When President Putin and Xi met in Russia of March 2023, Putin had hoped that Xi would offer a deal to create a direct pipeline between the two countries, making China more reliant on Russian crude oil and natural gas and giving Russia a direct buyer for their primary export. But no such agreement was reached. Xi did say publicly that China and Russia would continue to resolutely uphold the fundamental norms of international relations based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. But that statement blatantly ignores the illegality of Russia's invasion in the first place, which directly violates the Charter's core precepts. Putin's hopes for any concrete agreements for aid or mutual development never materialized. The summit was summed up by historian Sergei Radchenko with an old Chinese proverb, "Loud thunder but few raindrops." He then modified that statement as, "Scratch that, even the thunder wasn't all that loud." In fact, the Putin-Xi meetings actually caused further support for Ukraine, as Japanese Prime Minister Kishida used the opportunity to make a surprise trip to Ukraine to meet with President Zelensky. Despite Xi's efforts to lead China into a role of peacekeeper and world negotiator, he still has to deal with the hawks in his own government. On the heels of the Moscow summit, the Guangming Daily wrote an extensive article, more of a semi-official position piece declaring the four no's that China says they will not put up with. Number 1, the US should not make irresponsible remarks on normal exchanges between sovereign states. Number 2, the US should not compare China-Russia relations with a small circle of US allies. Number 3, the US should not undermine China's efforts to promote peace talks on the Ukraine issue. Number 4, the US should stop using the Ukraine crisis as an excuse to attack and sanction China. Some of this rhetoric is no doubt simply strong words, but they may also signal an effort to lay the groundwork for China to ramp up its military support for Russia's war, though so far there's no evidence of that. It gets worse for Russia. In addition to everything else that bodes ill for Russia, President Xi might not be willing to go all in on supporting a leader of Russia whose future appears very uncertain. Putin's been rumored to be in ill health for years. He was filmed walking with a limp when he visited Crimea in March of 2023. And in April, there were widespread reports that he had suffered from intense head pain, a numb tongue, and blurred vision. There have been numerous indications he might be suffering from Parkinson's disease, which manifests as an uncontrollable shaking in the extremities, primarily the hands and feet. And there are additional signs he might be undergoing chemotherapy, which can result in excessive weight gain. There's also signs that Putin has killed off anyone near him that might pose a threat to his continued dominance of the Russian government. Since just before the invasion of Ukraine, over 40 of Russia's top managers, businessmen, and high-level officials have died under unclear but very suspicious circumstances. Those deaths include being found in apparent murder-suicides, like Vladislav Aveyev, vice president of Gazprom Bank, and his pregnant wife and 13-year-old daughter, who were found dead in a Moscow apartment, while a former top manager of Novatek, Sergei Protosenya, was found hanged at his villa in Spain, with his wife and 18-year-old daughter also found murdered in the house. And Pavel Pshelnikov, director of communications at Digital Logistics LLC, a subsidiary of Russian Railways, supposedly shot himself at his home in Moscow. The deaths have become so numerous that one media source has given the wave a nickname, Sudden Russian Death Syndrome. But by and far, the most conspicuous means of death has been the archaic mid-18th century habit of defenestration, that is, falling out of a high window. Ravil Maganov, vice president of Lukoil, fell out of one at the Central Clinical Hospital of the presidential administration in Moscow, and in February 2023, Marina Yankina, head of the financial department of the defense ministry, was found dead after supposedly falling from a 16th floor of her apartment. Even when a suspect is in government custody, their lives aren't safe. Most recently, Igor Shikurko, Deputy General Director of firm Yakuchkenerga, was discovered dead of unknown causes in his cell in a detention center in Yakut, Siberia on April 5, 2023. The extremely high number of potentially murdered rivals paints Russia in a bad light, an unstable dictatorship afraid of its own best and brightest while making enemies of its own nascent leadership. Couple that with Putin's rumored ill health, and it's just one more reason why President Xi may want to wait a year or two before cementing any permanent relationships with whoever's in charge in Russia post-Ukraine. What will Russia and Ukraine do? China and Russia are in an unenviable position. Both countries are seeing an inevitable shrinking of their populations, with China admitting an overcounting of its population during the last census by as much as 100 million. The Pew Research Center forecasts a decline from 1.4 billion people this year to 1.3 billion by 2050 and a staggering reduction to below 800 million by 2100. That's according to the UN's medium variant, or middle-of-the-road projection. Russia's upside-down population pyramid is no better. They're already experiencing a massive brain drain as a repercussion from its Ukraine fiasco, which was followed by as many as 400,000 young men who left to avoid the first conscription call-up in September 2022. Combine that with an aging population, a lower birth rate, and a decrease in life expectancy of 15 years since early 2022, and Russia's population is in free fall. Both these troubled countries might believe then that their only window to have enough young males to support a war is rapidly shrinking. That leaves Putin and Xi with a difficult, if not impossible, decision: launch a war now that they're not ready for and probably can't win, or wait a few years when their populations and economies are even less capable of enduring such hardships. It's an unenviable decision for any leader to make.
China's meteoric economic rise in the last 3 decades has seen the world's largest nation pick itself up from its agrarian roots to become a robust and modern economy. While not more powerful than the US economically, China's is the only economy in the world to truly rival the US's. Yet all of China's economic expansion has created a crippling national Achilles heel: its overwhelming reliance on naval trade routes to export its trade goods and supply its ravenous appetite for oil. If China is to truly become a peer competitor to the US, it must secure and defend its access to the world's most important shipping lanes. In today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're taking a look at the Asian powerhouse and asking, is China ready to take on the US Navy? For decades, China focused primarily on maintaining national sovereignty by establishing a large ground force capable of fighting off another Japanese invasion or their former Soviet rivals. As China's economy expanded, though, its reliance on maritime trade grew to a staggering disproportion. While every nation relies on maritime trade, China's economy depends on the sea for 60 to 80% of its imports and exports, and almost all of its oil supply. This has placed China in a precarious situation where it is uniquely vulnerable to disruption of those trade routes and forced a shift in focus from a ground army to a growing naval and air force. China's maritime strategic position is unique and completely stacked against it. With the bulk of its oil passing through the Indian Ocean, another of China's longtime rivals, India, is in a position to easily disrupt and even completely shut down Chinese shipping. While China maintains a larger and better equipped naval force than India, Indian ships would enjoy land-based support and quick resupply, while China would have to find a way to forward deploy a sizable battle group to the Indian Ocean that could fend off not just the Indian Navy, but the land-based Indian Air Force as well. Not only is this currently strategically impossible for the limited Chinese Navy, but China also lacks the supply and logistics ships needed to keep a task force out at sea for extended periods of time. War against the US would likely involve India as an American ally, but even if it didn't, China would still have to face America's formidable Pacific Fleet. With 2,000 aircraft and 200 ships, to include 33 nuclear attack submarines, America's Pacific Fleet alone is more than a match for China's entire navy, which numbers at 193 combat ships and 710 aircraft. In any conflict, the US Pacific Fleet would also quickly be augmented by other American naval forces. So could China hope to fend off the US Pacific Fleet in the event of war? In 1996, in response to the US granting a visa to Taiwan's president Lee Teng-hui, China launched massive military exercises meant to intimidate Taiwan, beginning with live-fire missile and artillery firing just kilometers from Taiwan's shores. This was followed by a widely publicized amphibious assault exercise meant to signal that China was ready and willing to cross the Taiwan Strait and invade the long independent island. In response, the United States deployed 3 aircraft carrier battle groups to the area and an amphibious assault ship, the largest display of American military might in Asia since Vietnam. This brief confrontation forced the Chinese to admit that they could not hope to stop the US from defending Taiwan, and internally, Chinese military leadership doubted the possibility of defeating the US Navy in any combat scenario. Humiliated by the US's response and their inability to prevent it, China reshuffled its military priorities, placing a much greater emphasis on its naval, missile, and air forces. 2 decades later, their efforts have paid off in spades, with China boasting the largest ballistic missile force in the world and a competent, if still limited, navy. Yet China is still saddled with a great deal of internal issues, the most pressing being the systemic corruption that has for decades thrived amongst the Communist Party leadership and the armed forces both. Despite Xi Jinping's anti-corruption purges, the damage to China's military by a long legacy of corrupt and ineffective leadership could take years to reverse. China also faces a serious recruitment, training, and experience problem with its armed forces. Unable to meet military recruitment quotas, China's armed forces have been forced to lower their recruiting standards several times since 2010. This has resulted in a crop of recruits whose current capabilities are questionable to say the least. As noted by Chinese observers, in 2012, a People's Liberation Army unit became so stressed out in the midst of a 15-day wartime simulation that the ongoing exercise had to be put on pause and time taken out for movie nights and karaoke parties. By day 9 of the exercise, a cultural performance troupe, PLA parlance for song and dance girls, had to be brought in to entertain the homesick soldiers whose morale had plummeted. Further reporting notes that this is likely not an isolated incident, and Chinese watchdogs have long observed that China engages in little comprehensive training of its troops in comparison with their Western counterparts. In fact, China's confidence in its own troops is so low that it was only in the early 2010s that Chinese units began to take part in UN peacekeeping deployments, long refusing to take part out of fear of international embarrassment. To further compound China's challenges in waging war against the US or another peer power, the nation has not fought a major conflict since a brief skirmish against Vietnam in 1979. The modern Chinese military has absolutely no experience in modern combined arms warfare, and to further compound China's problems, it also lacks a joint command structure amongst its various military branches like the US employs. This means that in war, it would be difficult to coordinate Chinese ground forces with their air forces or naval forces with their missile forces, etc. Given the fast pace and chaotic nature of modern war, this would leave China unable to quickly respond to and defend from threats. After the humiliation of the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, China began to invest heavily into its missile forces with the goal of threatening American aircraft carriers from deep within the Chinese mainland. Maintaining the world's only missile service as a separate branch of its military, China's commitment to long-range standoff weapons is not to be underestimated. Yet despite boasting that its new DF-21 carrier killer ballistic missiles could shut the US out of the West Pacific, the truth behind these boasts is dubious at best. A ballistic missile strike on a moving target in the middle of the ocean requires a long and very complicated kill chain involving land-based radar, airborne radar, radar, satellites, and command and control nodes to all coordinate tracking and targeting of an enemy ship, and to date, China has not displayed the capability to successfully execute every step in this complex kill chain or to protect the individual links from attack or interference. Yet even the most optimistic American naval commanders acknowledge the threat that China's ballistic missiles present to a carrier battle group, which is why the US has responded by engaging in the most ambitious ballistic missile defense program in its history, testing everything from airborne to ship-installed directed energy weapons such as lasers to a new generation of the standard model anti-air missile to classified anti-satellite weapons projects. The US has taken the Chinese ballistic missile threat very seriously. China's missile forces are its best tool for keeping the US Navy at bay, but unproven as they are, it's doubtful just how effective they would ultimately be. However, the one thing that China, and most people in the US, tend to forget about are the US's submarine forces, and that's no coincidence. Secretive by design, the US's Silent Service is the most advanced submarine force in the world, and it maintains a constant rotation of 18 subs forward deployed in the Pacific, with another 8 loitering in potential conflict zones. For the US Navy in the Pacific, this means Chinese coastal waters, and with China's very limited anti-submarine capabilities and notoriously noisy subs, this underwater force alone would be enough to choke China's trade completely and sink the entirety of China's very small amphibious assault fleet should it try to invade Taiwan. Immune to China's ballistic missile forces, America's nuclear attack submarines are its best weapon in any conflict against China, something both China and the US are keenly aware of. In response, China has installed underwater listening sensors across the South China Sea, and for its part, the US has increased annual production of its new Virginia-class submarines to 2 a year through to at least 2030. China is not yet ready to take on the US Navy and win. Yet this is a deficiency it has clearly identified and is working to address with a huge expansion of its own navy, the building of 2 aircraft carriers, and building new diesel-powered submarines. But with a looming population crisis set to explode a demographic time bomb by 2030, where over 65% of its population will be of retirement age, China may find itself pressed for the economic resources it needs to continue expanding its military. The US also faces challenges in maintaining its global peacekeeping naval fleet, but with a strong network of alliances and access to financial networks China does not, it will take some serious and very focused investment in its navy, perhaps at the expense of its other branches, for China to ever truly challenge America in the open ocean.
The United States, the world's premier military power. China, a rising power that may one day be able to challenge the US's own, but today cannot. What if these two military giants went head-to-head though, and the conflict played out on China's own shores? What if the United States decided it needed to invade China? Could China defend from a US invasion? First though, is conflict between the two even probable? The short answer is yes, and the possibility is frighteningly real and seemingly only growing more realistic by the day. Today, these two great powers find themselves locked in what historians have come to term Thucydides' trap. Thucydides was an ancient Greek historian who commented on the rise of Athens and the fall of Sparta. For a long time, Sparta was the reigning power of the Greek world, until the city-state of Athens began to rival it in terms of economy, wealth, and military power. The end result was an inevitable war between the two city-states and their allies, as one side, Sparta, sought to hold on to its spot as the #1 power, and Athens sought to dislodge it. If you think that's ancient history, then consider that out of 16 instances in just the last 500 years alone of a rising power supplanting a pre-existing power, war broke out 12 out of 16 times. Clearly, the odds are not good that the US and China can avoid war. To make matters worse, the seeds of conflict between the two nations already exist in a variety of potential flashpoints. The biggest of these are Taiwan's continued independence and China's aggressive and illegal expansion into the South Pacific. Eventually, most likely due to the matter of Taiwan, a conflict between the US and China is likely, especially if China wants to prove it really is a great power. As long as the US Navy reigns supreme in the South Pacific, China cannot claim to be a great power and cannot influence its neighbors the way it wishes to. For China, conflict with the US is all but inevitable, not just a matter of national pride, but one of continued political survival for a communist party that finds itself increasingly isolated from the outside world by growing democratic movements along its borders. So what if the worst came to worse? Could the US successfully invade China? The US's greatest asset is the presence of its forces all around the world thanks to defense agreements with partners and allies. This is a mutually beneficial agreement as it provides a boost to the hosting nation's economy and ensures its continued defense in the case of a war. For the US, though, it has the added benefit of allowing it to stage forces all around the world and quickly react to a conflict. American forces, with their wide network of military installations and partnerships with nations all over the globe, allow them a degree of flexibility and mobility that no other nation can even come close to matching. In a war against China, the US would rely on its Pacific bases to prosecute the conflict. Spurred on by China's growing aggressiveness against its neighbors in the South Pacific, President Obama launched a strategy of encirclement, much like that employed so successfully against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Today, this means that US forces are deployed or can deploy from bases in Japan, the Philippines, Guam, South Korea, Singapore, Australia, and even Thailand. Plotted on a map, this clearly shows how American military power is posed to contain China, no matter in which direction it attempts to move its own military. The reverse is also true. The wide dispersion of US power in the South Pacific allows it to use military force against China from multiple avenues of approach, forcing Chinese defenses to spread out amongst a host of potential threat vectors. However, the primary purpose of US encirclement is not to start hostilities, but rather to respond to them or prevent them altogether. China's chief strategic problem is that it relies on overseas routes for most of its trade, with up to 60% of all Chinese trade passing through the South Pacific. Current US force predisposition has the foot in the US military poised straight on the jugular of Chinese trade, and it would not take much pressure to shut that trade off and send China into an economic collapse. In case of war, this is exactly what would happen. US forces would immediately begin a naval and air blockade of all Chinese trade, boxing in the Chinese Navy all the way from the Malacca Straits to the Sea of Japan. While the Chinese Navy now for the first time in history outnumbers the US's own Navy, it largely lacks a capability to operate far from its own shores and is best suited for coastal defense. This would make it impossible for China to send a naval expeditionary force to the Malacca Straits and secure them for its trade ships. Then there's the added complication of US allies and partners in the area who would indubitably join the US side in the conflict. Chinese ships trying to leave their territorial waters would find themselves threatened on all sides, on top of having to deal with the formidable American Pacific Fleet. At the same time that the US ships are blocking off Chinese trade, though, the People's Liberation Army rocket force would saturate US bases in Guam, South Korea, Japan, and possibly even the Philippines. These attacks would overwhelm American missile defenses and cause considerable damage, requiring weeks of repair to bring them back into operational status. This huge missile volley would greatly delay US offensive operations by both its air and naval fleets, not to mention the preparation of any sort of invasion force. However, it would also greatly anger the nations that host US forces, as missiles like the DF-21 ballistic missile have a margin of error that can be as much as several hundred meters. Missiles would be destroying not just US forces but also Japanese, South Korean, and Filipino military assets and even civilians. This would further cement support for US action against China. The Chinese missile stockpile numbers in the thousands, but it is ultimately finite, and military facilities can always be repaired faster than missile stockpile can be replenished. Not to mention that long before a second volley can be fired, US forces would have moved to heavily damage China's command and control assets. In the opening of the war, American stealth bombers would strike at Chinese long-range surveillance radar, command and control nodes, and precision military systems deep inside the country. These attacks would be mirrored by a missile barrage nearly as large as China's own being launched by America's large submarine fleet, most of which are capable of carrying long-range land attack cruise missiles. While China may be able to hold the US surface navy at bay with its rocket forces for a few weeks, possibly even a few months, the US submarine force would be impossible to target with those same rocket forces. And given China's extreme lack of anti-submarine warfare assets, the American Silent Service would all but have the run of China's coast. American stealth aircraft and submarine forces would continue striking deep into China, destroying air defense networks, satellite communication nodes, and other vital facilities for coordinating China's ability to threaten the American Navy. US stealth bomber losses would no doubt be very high, potentially knocking the entire fleet of 20 US B-2 bombers out of commission within the first few weeks. Air attacks would then have to rely on unmanned drones, supplemented by submarine cruise missile strikes, but eventually Chinese defenses would be eroded enough to allow B-1 and even B-52 strategic bombers to begin to soften up Chinese coastal defenses. Going any further inland would likely be fatal for B-1 and B-52s, even at this stage of the war, with the Chinese Air Force suppressed but very much still capable. Escorting those non-stealthy bombers, however, would be American F-22 Raptors and F-35s, which would operate from repaired facilities in Japan and South Korea. While the U.S. would suffer losses to both its F-22 and F-35 fleets, the loss ratio would be extremely favorable. After a few weeks of air operations, enough of China's air defenses and most of its formidable fighter aircraft would have been thinned out to allow non-stealthy U.S. Air Force F-15s and Navy F-18s to join the fight, considerably boosting the presence of American combat aircraft. American air forces are not just more capable than China's, but considerably larger as well, with 13,264 total aircraft versus China's 3,210. Of those aircraft, the U.S. operates nearly double as many combat aircraft as China, at 2,085 versus 1,232. To make matters worse for China, U.S. aircraft are overwhelmingly more modern and capable, and its pilots more experienced. China may have the home field advantage, but the U.S. would dominate the air and sea war within a few months, putting a stranglehold on China economically. In the real world, this is the limit of the U.S.'s plans for a war with China. Destroy its Navy and Air Force and strangle it economically into submission. In today's scenario, though, we're taking this a step further. Preparation for an invasion of China would take many months and require the mustering of most of the U.S.'s amphibious forces. If the U.S. wanted to gather an invasion force and maintain its global commitments as they stand today, it would need to institute a national draft, which could potentially see it add up to 145 million additional personnel to its military. However, China's 1.3 billion strong population could muster up a defensive force of 753 million. Though with its much smaller military budget, a floundering economy due to the U.S.'s stranglehold on its trade, and damage on its infrastructure caused by American air and naval attacks, China would only realistically be able to train up and equip a small percentage of this number. Likewise, the U.S. would only be able to equip a small percentage of its own reservists, leaving the numbers advantage firmly in Chinese hands. The U.S. has always had the capability to move forces around in large numbers relatively fast, but in recent years it's greatly increased its expeditionary capabilities, adding a number of mobile landing platforms, afloat forward staging bases, and amphibious assault ships. Today, the U.S. maintains 3 Marine Expeditionary Forces, its primary force dedicated to kicking down the door on hostile beaches all over the world. Each force can bring to an enemy's shore between 20,000 and 90,000 Marines and sailors. These would quickly be supplemented by U.S. Army Expeditionary Forces, though they would require longer to assemble, prepare, and transport to a hostile Chinese beach. Initially, the American Marines would be forced to hold the beach alone, though they would not be able to land in their full numbers all at the same time. Not wishing to spread themselves too thin, and with U.S. air and naval power only capable of carving out a very small slice of safety on hostile Chinese beaches, U.S. forces may at best approach the numbers of the amphibious assault in Normandy, averaging between 15,000 and 20,000 personnel per day. This would require a full 3.5 days for an entire Marine Expeditionary Force to make the beach. This would leave 20,000 Marines with the unenviable task of holding a narrow strip of beach against a People's Liberation Army of around 975,000, not counting reservists and conscripts. Even with air superiority achieved, U.S. and Allied aircraft could not hope to hold at bay the vast number of Chinese ground troops, and it's likely that even before the first Marine Expeditionary Force could completely offload onto the beach, the Marines holding them would have been thrown back out into the ocean. Sheer numbers alone make an invasion of the Chinese mainland completely impossible for even the technologically superior U.S., and it would require the unloading of an entire Marine Expeditionary Force in one single landing to secure a foothold against the vast numbers of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. This is precisely why the United States has no plans of invading China, and instead plans on simply destroying the Chinese Navy and Air Force while blockading it economically in the case of war.
China is set to be the first nation in the world to field an aircraft carrier to truly rival America's fleet of supercarriers. But how good is China's first attempt at a supercarrier? And why would a fight between the two likely end with China's brand new carrier becoming China's brand new coral reef? The United States has been operating aircraft carriers for over 100 years now, while China is relatively new to the carrier club. This gives the U.S. a significant advantage over China when it comes to running carrier operations, which are notoriously a very tough and dangerous lesson for nations to learn. The United States earned its stripes through many years of very dangerous training and testing, losing many pilots and deck crew in the process. However, China has shown it's a quick learner and has yet to suffer a major naval deck accident. While the plan has lost numerous aircraft as it learns to operate its new aircraft carriers, it has the benefit of emulating the nation that does it the best, the United States. Lessons learned from observing U.S. carrier ops
has significantly decreased the learning curve and reduced the price in blood China has had to pay to gain proficiency. But China is far from matching the United States when it comes to operating the most advanced types of warships ever created. Aircraft carriers are floating airfields operating hundreds if not thousands of miles from home. They need to be able to launch very heavy aircraft at fast enough speeds to get them airborne and recover them by bringing them in from takeoff speed to a stop in mere seconds. Anything more complex than a routine training exercise requires careful coordination of hundreds of personnel, and combat operations are something else altogether, with aircraft taking off and landing at the same time. A delicate ballet that the US has learned to perform expertly at a very high price in lives and aircraft lost. China has yet to show this capability, and while it has performed well in training cruises, it's yet to try the really hard stuff like combat-paced operations, such as launch and recovery at night and in inclement weather. The US Navy is an all-weather, 24-hour force trained to pressure an enemy relentlessly, giving no pause no matter how bad the weather is or how dark it gets. These types of carrier operations, however, are notoriously dangerous, and from time to time the US still manages to lose a plane or two. However, China has yet to attempt those more dangerous of carrier operations, and it remains to be seen how well its deck crews and pilots will perform when Mother Nature is beating down on them or in the dead of night. While they will likely learn to master inclement weather and nighttime ops, for now the US retains a significant advantage in this area. What about the physical ships though? How do the two match up? First, it's important to note that the very philosophy behind the use of carriers differs between the US and China. The United States sees its carrier as a global force capable of fighting and winning anywhere on the planet. If you start a mess, you can expect the US carrier off the shore of your country within 3 to 9 business days. China, however, is incapable of global power projection due to a lack of large surface combatants and global logistics capabilities. Thus, its aircraft carrier is instead meant for regional operations, never far from the shore or support of shore-based assets. This is good enough for now, when the greatest challenge the Type 003 might face is a fight against a US carrier strike group for the Malacca Strait. However, if China wishes to dethrone the US as a global superpower and impose its will upon the world, then the Type 003 is not the carrier for the job. China's Type 3 will be conventionally powered, which already places it at a massive disadvantage against a Ford-class American carrier. US carriers are nuclear-powered, which not only makes their range infinite but comes with a host of follow-on benefits. For instance, without the need for refueling, US carriers don't need their own dedicated oiler to keep them in the fight. This significantly reduces an enemy's ability to disrupt a US carrier by targeting support vessels. The Chinese Type 3, however, will require constant resupply, a link in the chain of Chinese naval operations that the US weapons are extremely well suited to breaking. Long-range stealth anti-ship missiles and the US's nuclear attack submarine fleet all pose deadly threats to support assets and will put pressure on China to fight more defensively than it would otherwise need to. The biggest advantage of the Ford's two powerful nuclear reactors, however, is their ability to generate more electricity than the ships need. This makes it possible to install future technology onto the ship without requiring a massive redesign or lengthy overhaul. The Type 03 doesn't have this capability and is largely stuck in the configuration it'll launch in. The US, meanwhile, is looking to soon add technology like directed energy weapons to its carriers and has more than enough juice to do so. US carriers are future-friendly. The Type 003 is not. However, this is hardly surprising. The Type 3 is China's first attempt at an indigenous carrier that can begin to match US capabilities. It's not a final design, so to speak, but rather one that'll influence the evolution of carrier design in the People's Liberation Army Navy. The Type 3 is also about 17 meters shorter than the Ford, at about 316 meters and a displacement of 80,000 tons, versus the Ford's 333 meters and displacement of 100,000 tons. Mass is important in surface warfare because larger ships are simply more difficult to sink. As seen in U.S. naval live-fire exercises on decommissioned carriers, U.S. carriers are incredibly difficult to actually sink. In 2018, Rear Admiral Lu Yuan of the People's Liberation Army Navy stated that the U.S. was so afraid of casualties that China could solve its territorial dispute with Taiwan and neighboring nations by simply sinking 2 U.S. carriers. Lu said, quote, "We'll see how frightened America is after losing 10,000 sailors." Rear Admiral Yuan has clearly never heard of 2 things. The first, Pearl Harbor, and the second, a 2005 SINK-X, where the Navy tried to sink the decommissioned aircraft carrier, the America. The carrier suffered 4 straight weeks of abuse of all kinds until she finally had to be scuttled by onboard demolition teams. However, it's important to note that the America was not being subjected to real weapons, but rather controlled explosives. The point of the testing was to see how to build better carriers to withstand combat damage, not to immediately sink her. However, not only did the America survive an intense battery of tests, but the Navy also took the lessons learned from the 2005 SINK-X and put them straight into the Ford. The USS America remains the only supercarrier to ever be sunk, and China is not privy to all the incredibly valuable information that the US Navy gathered from such an unprecedented exercise. There's no doubt that at a fundamental design level, the Ford is simply better engineered than the Type 3. There is one big improvement the Type 3 enjoys that the Ford shares, and the Chinese likely stole it from the US in the first place. While previous Chinese carriers employed ski-jump-style launch systems, the Type 3 will employ an electromagnetic catapult just like the Ford. This means China will finally be able to launch aircraft with full gas and combat loads, something it's unable to do aboard the Type 1 or Type 2. Electromagnetic catapults also significantly reduce complexity, decreasing maintenance and operating costs, as well as being able to be more finely tuned for various aircraft and payloads. This directly reduces stresses on the airframe and extends their service life. But how mature is Chinese technology over its American counterpart? Nobody knows, and the US has been having notorious difficulties with the Ford's catapult over the years that have taken time to iron out. China is standing on the US's shoulders and has been able to bypass a significant amount of research and development though. Aircraft are a carrier's primary weapon, and here China is definitely on the disadvantage. The Ford can carry up to 90 aircraft, with about 3/4 of them being combat aircraft. It's unknown how many the Type 3 will ultimately carry, but it's believed it'll carry about 40 fighters. This leaves the Type 3 outgunned against a Ford. But the types of fighters also matter, and once more China is on the disadvantage in this area too. In March of 2023, the USS Gerald R. Ford deployed with its full air wing for the first time, Carrier Air Wing 8. Currently, the Navy plans to operate its Ford-class carriers with a mixed complement of battle-tested F-18s and new F-35Cs. By working together, the F-35s will be able to dramatically increase the survivability and lethality of their non-stealthy counterparts, as the F-35 can act as a miniature airborne control platform, guiding weapons fired by non-stealth aircraft safely out of reach of the enemy to their targets. However, the Navy is well on track to fully operate F-35Cs from its aircraft carriers as production continues to ramp up. A flying supercomputer, the F-35C is an aircraft with no peer in the Chinese arsenal. Its stealth doesn't make it invisible, but instead makes it incredibly difficult to acquire a weapons quality lock before it's already firing at you. This advantage alone makes it a lethal threat to Chinese air forces, but with its Block 4 upgrades, which will supercharge this already powerful fighter with a host of new electronic warfare capabilities, the F-35s will receive a capability no other fighter in the world can match: the ability to escort itself through skies filled with dense enemy radar networks. The upgraded AIM-260 air-to-air missile will not just neutralize China's only real current advantage, but overmatch it, with a range of at least 120 miles. The US Navy will finally outrange the Chinese PL-15, which is estimated to have a range of about 100 miles. The F-35 will also carry the Advanced Anti-Radiation Guided Missile Extended Range, a weapon specifically designed to take on China's anti-access area denial defense systems. Successfully tested against a moving target on December 8, 2022, the AAR-GMER can engage enemy radar systems from outside of their threat envelope, keeping its host aircraft safe. Even if the enemy turns off its radar, the AAR-GMER can use advanced digital modeling to locate its likely target and leverage onboard sensors to correctly identify a powered-down radar and destroy it. A missile believed to be China's new anti-radiation missile was spotted in 2020 under the wings of a J-11 fighter. However, little is known about its capabilities, though we do know that China lags significantly behind the US when it comes to sophistication of its weapon systems. The core of China's problem, though, comes from its carrier fighter, the J-15, nicknamed the Flying Shark. It's better known as the Flopping Fish in Chinese military media. The jet was based on a prototype Su-33 purchased from Ukraine, which the Chinese reverse-engineered, much to the chagrin of the Russians, who've watched China buy sample sizes of Russian tech only to reverse-engineer them and make their own versions. In effect, China made the Wish version of a Russian carrier fighter with predictable results. The J-15 suffers from a common problem that all Chinese jets face: bad engines. The Chinese utilize WS-10 engines built by Shenyang Liming Aircraft Engine Company, themselves copies of Russian Salyut Lyutka AL-31FN engines. However, developing aircraft engines is an incredibly complicated endeavor, and the Chinese have not shown that they're quite up to par. As such, the WS-10 significantly limits the operational range and payload capacity of China's air fleets. Recently, a J-20 was shown in flight with testing models of the WS-15, an indigenous design meant to overcome significant shortcomings of the WS-10. On paper, the WS-15 seems set to deliver the kind of performance that the J-15 desperately needs if it's going to go toe-to-toe with American fighters. However, as China remains one of the most opaque nations in the world on military matters, it's unknown just how capable the WS-15 engine truly is. What is known is that Chinese engines are notoriously unreliable. One American pilot remarked at the surprise of Chinese pilots when he told them how he had performed a circumnavigation of the Earth with his F-16 without significant engine maintenance. While the lifespan of U.S. engines is measured in thousands of flight hours, Chinese engines are measured in the hundreds. The J-15 is also one of the chunkiest carrier fighters in the world, weighing in at 35,000 pounds versus the F-18 at 32,000 pounds. This is a significant problem when the plane is still stuck with inferior engines. With an estimated 60 J-15s in service, China also has a critical lack of combat-ready carrier planes to replace inevitable losses. The U.S. Navy currently has about 30 F-35Cs and 273 on order, with 512 F-18s ready to roll. When it comes to numbers, the U.S. is better suited to replace combat losses with better aircraft than China. But China is making strides toward developing the FC-31, a 5th-gen carrier-based fighter which has been spotted in flight testing. The U.S. has stated that once operational, the FC-31 will be a significant threat to 4th-generation U.S. aircraft, but it's unknown how it'll fare against U.S. F-35s. It's also unknown when exactly the FC-31 will enter production or how many the Chinese will acquire. What is known is that China is lagging significantly behind the U.S., with the American Navy already designing a 6th-generation carrier fighter. The Air Force version of a 6th-gen fighter, known as NGAD, has already been confirmed to be in flight, so by the time China fields the FC-31, it might find the brief parity it enjoyed quickly overshadowed by more capable U.S. aircraft. Ultimately, it's unknown which carrier would beat which in a one-on-one match, though overwhelmingly the signs point to a U.S. victory. With far more experience than China and more mature and better technology in most areas, the U.S. is simply the more competent combatant in this scenario. However, this is not a reason to diminish the threat that Chinese carriers can and will pose to U.S. forces, as China has proven it's a very quick learner. And while it may lag behind the U.S. technologically, the weapons China does field still present a significant threat. With only publicly available unclassified information to work with, the only way to know how each carrier would truly handle itself in battle would be for said battle to actually take place, a tragedy for the world at large as the planet's two biggest economic powers go to war. All eyes are on the Russian bear as it marches across Eastern Europe. But is the bigger threat to the world hiding in the East? Is China actually plotting to take over the world? As a president famously said, that depends on your definition of is. There's no question that China is a massive world power. In fact, depending on your standards, it might be only the second superpower in the world after the United States. It's the most populous country in the world, with over 4 times the population of the US. It has the second largest economy of the world, the 3rd largest country in size behind Russia and Canada, and is one of only a small number of nuclear powers in the world. It's certainly the biggest power in Asia, and it might have much bigger ambitions than that. But what are China's actual plans for the world? To find that out, you can look close to home. The province of Hong Kong, which was a British territory for decades, was handed back to China in 1997 after negotiations which created a plan of one country, two systems. Hong Kong would be allowed to maintain its autonomy and run itself as a democracy, while China would administer certain larger affairs and it would officially be part of the larger country. That was the system for a while, until China decided it wasn't anymore, and the People's Republic of China has been tightening the screws ever since. And China has been through plenty of changes itself. Since China became a communist country in 1949 under Mao Zedong, it's been a dictatorship. But Mao's strict adherence to the communist dogma, which led to brutal famines and repression, have long since been replaced with a very different system under Deng Xiaoping and the current leader Xi Jinping. The country kept its autocratic system of government while replacing its economic policies with a sort of hybrid government-controlled capitalism. Under this system, China's economy has exploded and has become one of the world's largest producers of electronics, appliances, and mined rare earth minerals essential for manufacturing. But in other ways, China's modernization did not bring good things. While China is only loosely a communist country now, their security state is still very similar to what it was under Mao, only with a high-tech twist. In the modern age, governments use the internet heavily to gain intelligence on potential threats. That's true in China and in most other countries, with powerful tech companies turning over information to the government as needed. In China, websites like TikTok contain extensive tracking software that the Chinese government uses for unknown purposes. And internally, China has become notorious for its social credit system. This ranks citizens based on their perceived loyalty to the government and their conduct in other ways, with various privileges being granted only to those with higher social credit scores. And if you're under China's thumb, there is little you can do to escape. Hong Kong was given guarantees of a certain level of autonomy for a specific term, but in recent years those guarantees have been largely overrun. While they still have separate elections, Chinese authorities increasingly interfere in them and disqualify or arrest candidates who oppose the People's Republic's policies. This often leads to largely unopposed elections, and the recent COVID shutdowns led to China getting even more directly involved in shutting down protests and public gatherings. So, if you're inside China, you're probably kept under a pretty tight grip. But what if you're outside it? That depends on where you are, because China has been involved in a territorial conflict near its borders for almost 70 years now. When the People's Republic of China took control, it was in the middle of a brutal civil war. The Communists ultimately won, but the forces of the Republic of China managed to consolidate their forces on the island of Taiwan and hold it, essentially creating a new country there. The only problem is, China still refuses to recognize Taiwan as an independent country. In fact, while they claim they're the legitimate government of Taiwan, the Taiwanese government, now a democracy, still claims it's the rightful government of mainland China. But the People's Republic has much more power, and they've managed to use diplomatic pressure to prevent international recognition of Taiwan as a United Nations member state. And they're not afraid to punch back against big targets. China takes it as a personal offense when anyone recognizes Taiwan as being independent, even if that person isn't actually the head of a country. That's why most US politicians have avoided paying visits to Taiwan in the last few decades, to avoid causing any diplomatic crises for the president. But in 2022, Speaker Nancy Pelosi and some other members of Congress decided to make a visit to the island nation, and China responded hard. They stepped up military drills around the island, terrorizing the citizens, and one Chinese propagandist even said the country should shoot down Pelosi's plane. While clearly that would have started a hot war between China and the US, and cooler heads prevailed, it was clear China was willing to escalate in a hurry. But is China all talk and no action? That depends on where you look. While they get a lot of attention for their over-the-top online personality, with colorful propagandists spreading conspiracy theories and trying to meme, they actually do maintain a very strong deterrent against international criticism. And it's one Russia is fond of as well. China's justice system is notoriously harsh, with long sentences and the death penalty on the table for many crimes, far more than murder or treason. And while most of the people in Chinese prisons are Chinese, they have commonly arrested people from other countries for the purpose of prisoner exchanges. When the CEO of Chinese company Huawei was arrested in Canada, it wasn't long before a Canadian citizen was arrested in China on drug charges. But China's reach is growing fast. No one knows exactly what China's long-term plans are. The People's Republic has made many claims about invading Taiwan, and they're no doubt looking closely at Russia and Ukraine to see how that would go. But it's not going well for Russia. Most of the world has committed to supporting Ukraine with military and financial backing, and Russia has found itself increasingly isolated and sanctioned. While Taiwan isn't universally acknowledged as an independent country the same way Ukraine was, the United States has promised to defend it. So any sort of hot war on the island would likely escalate quickly with potential nuclear consequences. So China might be taking a slower, more global approach. China's internet efforts go far beyond an army of internet trolls, and they might just be becoming the world's most premier cyber hacking organization. While they're certainly not sharing the details of their operations, it's believed that they have 3 divisions of cyber warriors: specialized military forces that train in cyber attacks and work on behalf of the government, state workers who aren't in the military but are tasked with cyber warfare and spying, and a group of non-government workers who are likely hired by the government and have more deniability when they need to break into rival governments' networks. And they've caused a lot of damage. Who has China hacked? Who haven't they hacked? Countless countries have claimed that Chinese hackers have taken classified data. Australia claimed that a 2013 attack accessed the blueprints of their intelligence headquarters, while Canada reported in 2011 an attack compromised multiple federal departments. Japan has reported at least 200 cyber attacks on Japanese companies and scientific institutes, while China's frequent rival India reported multiple denial-of-service attacks that may have come from agents of the Chinese government. Ukraine reported attacks during the opening days of the war, maybe China acting on behalf of Russia, and even the Vatican reported hacking attacks. The US has been the top target of Chinese cyber attacks for a long time, with reports of attacks on military, government, commercial, and industrial organizations. Even the largest companies in the world aren't safe. Google was hacked in 2010 and reported that the privacy of its users was compromised. They also went after massive companies like military contractor Northrop Grumman and manufacturing giant Dow Chemical. An attack on Yahoo might have had less implications for national security, but they probably got a good look at your mom's emails, including that extended exchange with a Nigerian prince. So what does China actually want with all this data? Well, if you ask them, they'd say, "We don't know what you're talking about. No cyber hacking here," as they proceed to hack another company. And because China refuses to fess up to its cyber hacking efforts, it's hard to say what they're actually after. While they hack private companies, it might be Chinese-style capitalism at work, stealing trade secrets so they can give them to their own companies, allowing them to produce lower-cost remakes of major US products, giving them a leg up in the market. They may also be looking for key access to diplomatic cables in their hacking of government institutions, but cybersecurity experts worry about a much bigger threat. If China knows how to get into the mainframes of major companies and government institutions, then they might be looking for a way to turn them off. And if they were ever to initiate war over Taiwan or another country, being able to kneecap the US's military and civilian infrastructure at exactly the right moment could give them the edge they need to finish the job. But is China actually planning a big move? If they are, they've been putting their pieces on the board for a long time. China has a long reach in Asia that goes far beyond Taiwan and Hong Kong. They unilaterally claim sovereignty over the entire South China Sea, which puts them into conflict with Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries. China's claim means that they have the authority to stop intelligence-gathering activities by foreign militaries in the sea, which has led to multiple near misses between Chinese aircraft and those of other countries. The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines during a recent dispute, and China's response was to reiterate its claims and continue its campaign of harassment. So why does China want this territory so much? Some people think it's just maximalism. After all, if you claim the sea surrounding a bunch of countries, it's really not a big reach to then claim those countries. But the ocean itself is incredibly valuable, with an estimated 11 billion barrels of untapped oil and almost 200 trillion cubic feet of natural gas hiding far below the waves. If China manages to get the world to accept their authority over these islands, they would have a huge leg up in energy production, something they very much need with their massive population and energy needs. This area also has multiple highly sought-after fishing areas, which would give China the food it needs without having to rely on imports. And more importantly, they would control access to the food of many poorer countries who would have no choice but to align with them. And when you can't find a beachhead, why not make one? China has been known to take over small islands in the South China Sea, but they've started taking another approach, building artificial islands in the South China Sea that let them create unchallenged military staging grounds. These islands are typically built on rocks or reefs that are close to the surface of the water. After dredging the area to create a more solid floor, they're covered with harder material and turned into small military bases. This turns the disputed sea area into what's de facto Chinese territory and serves as an act of intimidation against any other country that tries to set foot in the area. But is China a threat to the region? So far, China seems to be trying to win through soft power rather than open military action. They're hands down the biggest military power in the region, which means that any other country is likely to back down when directly challenged. While North Korea and India are also nuclear powers, North Korea is typically aligned with China, and India is preoccupied by its conflict with Pakistan. China's tensest relations in the region are with Vietnam, which it fought wars with previously. Now the two communist countries have hit rough waters, with China increasingly encroaching on Vietnam's coastline in the South China Sea while harassing Vietnamese ships. In 2014, China began building an oil rig deep within Vietnam's ocean territory. China seems to be making itself a regional power through sheer force of will, but elsewhere it's taking a very different approach. There's no continent more open to realignment than Africa, historically the subject of colonialism, occupation, and a brutal slave trade. Many of its nations only gained independence in the 20th century, often at the conclusion of bloody wars. Now, while many of the countries do have good diplomatic relations with Europe and North America, there are naturally old wounds to heal. And that's why China sees the continent as a massive opportunity for expansion. But this time, they're not looking to intimidate their way into a seat at the table. They're looking to buy their way in. Chinese investments in Africa have gained a lot of attention in recent years as the country moves many of its manufacturing efforts there. Africa is far away from China's expansionist actions in the South China Sea, and as such, many African countries are neutral to China. So when a Chinese firm shows up looking to build a factory there, they're likely to be approved. And China knows how to sweeten the deal. They'll frequently build new housing or other infrastructure as part of their investment, creating potential loyalists down the line should the world divide between China and the US. And for China, investing in Africa just makes sense. Many people see Africa as the future of the world. Not only is the population of the region expected to double in the next 30 years, the highest growth of any continent, but 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies are located there. That makes Africa the world's best place for future investments, and China has made it clear that they're not just restoring the old dynamic of Africa being used as a looting ground for world powers. They frequently staff their companies with African workers, providing jobs to the local economy, although they tend to be low-skill and low-paid jobs, while Chinese figures hold the higher positions. But is this good or bad for Africa? Some worry that China is setting Africa up for what's called a debt trap, where they invest heavily in a country in exchange for promises of repayment of the investment, only for the profits to never come and the country to be stuck in a state of limbo. That hasn't happened so far, as it doesn't seem like China simply wants to extract resources or money from Africa. They view it as a diplomatic investment as well. China wants to control the tech infrastructure in these countries, bringing industry to many of them for the first time. If China was to go to war with the United States and NATO, those countries would find themselves potentially cut off from a massive infrastructure network as China had commandeered it. One of the biggest concerns about this effort is that the heavy industrialization in African countries is hurting their environment, but the governments in most countries seem excited for the investment. But is there a longer plan at work here? China seems to have a hand in just about every region, similar to the other superpowers of the past and present. For Europe and North America, they mostly have cautious diplomacy and an aggressive cyber-hacking strategy to gain intelligence. For their neighbors in Asia, they approach with belligerence and flex their muscles to claim territory. But for nations in the so-called Third World, there's often an outstretched hand instead, offering heavy investments and possibly an alliance against the older powerhouses of the world. And some think this might be all coming together for China to make a big move. Many people have said the 21st century could be a Chinese century, with the country's economy growing by leaps and bounds. But they've been hit hard by their efforts to contain the COVID-19 pandemic, leading to economic slowdowns. Additionally, they've lost many diplomatic allies in the West due to their aggressive military tactics and their domestic policies, particularly their internment of the massive Uyghur Muslim population and their treatment of other minority groups like Buddhists and the Falun Gong movement. That's kept their growth in check, with many Western countries becoming more hesitant to invest heavily there. Which then leads people to worry, are they biding their time for a military move? China is incredibly powerful militarily, maybe the second strongest military in the world. While Russia has the most nuclear weapons of any country, its weapons are old and unreliable to the point where no one knows how many would even fire. China's estimated to have only 350 nuclear weapons, a far smaller arsenal than the US, but every single one of them is in working order, and many are attached to powerful missiles that could hit just about anywhere in the world. They're also one of only a few countries to have aircraft carriers, and their naval and aerial fleets are believed to be competitive with the US's fleet. But their biggest weapon might be how prepared they are. So if China was planning to actually take over the world, how would they go about it? The first step would likely to be to plan with some other countries. China has become one of Russia's few remaining allies since the war with Ukraine, helping them get around sanctions and providing vital economic help. So if China wanted to make its own move on Taiwan, or a much bigger plan, it would likely pull in Russia for help. A coordinated attack on several targets might be much harder to coordinate, and they might have a third partner as well, North Korea, run by the infamous Kim Jong-un. Like China and Taiwan, North Korea has never accepted the independence of South Korea, even after 70 years. A three-pronged attack like this might take the world by surprise. But would they actually win? In terms of a full military invasion, we've seen how Russia has performed and North Korea has never been tested against a military outside its peninsula. But China's naval fleet is fearsome, and many believe it could fight the US fleet to a standstill in the Pacific. And when you have two nuclear powers standing off shooting at each other, there's always the risk of escalation. China could not win a nuclear war with the US, but a major nuclear exchange would likely mean neither country is left standing. So China is hoping to avoid nuclear war, and it might have a plan to do so. Could China win a war without firing a shot? This might be where China's cyber hacking infrastructure comes into play. Unlike other military attacks, hackers don't announce themselves. They sneak in under the cover of darkness. Imagine if one morning America woke up and nothing was working. The internet was down, smart devices were malfunctioning, and even the government's connections weren't working. They spend hours getting things up and running, and tune into the news to find out that Chinese warships are shelling Taiwan. Their military has established beachheads in Vietnam and the Philippines, and North Korea has crossed the DMZ. While the fighting is far from over, China has declared their invasion successful and says that any interference from the US would be an invasion of their territory. Surely the United States would arm up, right? Not so fast. Maybe China calls in its chips with Africa and cuts the US off from several key suppliers. Supply chain issues are a bane of Russia in the Ukraine war, and the United States might now face the same problem. China would have cut off its supplies, as will any country aligned with it. More critical, and occupied Taiwan would no longer provide America with the key semiconductors it needs to operate much of its technology, and the United States would have to think twice before expanding key military technology. While South Korea's fearsome military would likely be able to hold off North Korea for a long time, and China would likely rein in the North to keep them from using nuclear weapons, it's unlikely that Taiwan or Southeast Asian nations could hold out too long without support. But is this where China would want to stop? Taking over much of Asia has been China's goal for a long time, and if this plan would work, it would have pulled it off without getting bogged down in a global conflict. This would firmly entrench it as a superpower and make the United States look toothless. More countries would be looking to align with China, and that includes India. China's goal would likely be to turn India into a regional client state rather than actively trying to conquer it. And with Pakistan on one side and China on the other, they could put a lot of pressure on the subcontinent. Smaller nations in the region would likely choose to align with China for protection, and China's next big step would be to expand further out into the Pacific. Many small island nations there could be pressured into signing deals, giving the Chinese free rein in exchange for protection, and that might bring China into direct conflict with the United States. While most Pacific islands are independent nations by now, the United States has several territories, including Guam and American Samoa. While they're unlikely to try to annex any of them outright, at least at this stage, they would likely start treating them in a similar way to the way they did Vietnam initially. They would just step on their sovereignty as much as they want and dare them to respond. Would the United States tolerate this? That depends on the political climate at the time. How much hunger does the US have for a conflict with a rival superpower? Does the public agree with defending these islands, or do they leave them to their fate? If they're left to their fate, that's another blow against the United States' standing in the world. And the next on the chopping block is Hawaii, an actual state but located thousands of miles away from the mainland. With a strong independence movement, could China make inroads there? So China's plan may not be to conquer the world in a shock and awe military campaign against the most powerful armies in the world. It might simply be planning to expand its power and influence piece by piece until it stands alone as the most powerful superpower in the world.
It's late February earlier this year, and somewhere above the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, a U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon aircraft is conducting routine surveillance of Chinese ships and installations along the group of remote reefs and man-made artificial islands. These islands have been built by China over the last 2 decades, as the nation lays claim to what it calls territorial waters, despite the fact that this territory is hundreds of miles from the Chinese coast and has been declared illegal by an international court ruling at The Hague. China, however, rejected the ruling and continued to build up its military presence on these faraway islands, reclaiming land from the ocean and building runways long enough to accommodate Chinese warplanes, radar and radar jamming installations, and missile batteries. With the international community rejecting China's illegal claim to the area, the United States has routinely engaged in surveillance and freedom of navigation exercises in order to delegitimize the Chinese claim and to keep tabs on the military developments in the area. Today, a Navy Poseidon spy plane is approaching one of these artificial islands when, from thousands of feet below it, a Chinese Navy destroyer suddenly targets the American plane. Using an extremely powerful military-grade laser, the destroyer aims straight at the cockpit, sending dazzling light into the aircraft and temporarily blinding the pilots. Undeterred, the U.S. plane continues its mission, but for a brief moment the world hung on the edge of its next major war. This incident is incredibly not a rare case, as U.S. ships and planes have pursued freedom of navigation exercises and intelligence-gathering missions in the area. They've been routinely intercepted by Chinese ships and planes,
But why is this going on, and how could it lead to World War III? Since 1947, China has laid claim to what it calls territorial waters within a 9-dash line created by the Chinese government at the time. This extends from the southern Chinese coast almost 1,000 miles all the way out to the coast of Borneo and extends to Vietnam and the Philippines coast as well. The claim is not just illegal but incredibly ludicrous. It would be like the United States claiming territorial waters, the entirety of the Gulf of Mexico, all the way to Venezuela. China, however, is undeterred, and in the early 2000s began a campaign of island building by reclaiming land from the ocean and building upon pre-existing reefs. This was a first attempt to legitimize its claims, as no nation can claim water around an island feature unless that island can be proven to support human life. China's answer was to shortcut that clause in international maritime law by creating an island where one didn't exist, and then setting up troop barracks and flying in supplies. Surrounded by neighbors much weaker than itself, while the island building actions were condemned, they weren't challenged militarily. The last time a nation had dared to stand up to China was in 1988, when Vietnamese forces were dispatched to drive away Chinese incursion into an island within their own economic exclusion zone. A confrontation between Vietnam and the Chinese led to China killing over 60 Vietnamese Marines and destroying 3 Vietnamese Navy ships. China officially occupied the reef and has held it ever since. A similar incident was in the making later in 1994 with the Philippines, but the Philippine government, remembering the killing of Vietnamese Marines and sailors by the Chinese, decided to back down and allow China to occupy features within its own territorial waters. But why does China want this massive amount of ocean territory even when it's so far from home? Well, that's because this area of the world is relatively underdeveloped by the gas and oil industry and is home to some of the world's largest energy reserves that are still relatively untapped, rivaled only by the waters around the North Pole. The U.S. Energy Information Agency estimates that there are around 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 11 billion barrels of oil in the area, with a 2012 U.S. Geological Survey estimating that an additional 160 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 12 billion barrels of oil are still undiscovered. This equates to trillions of dollars in untapped wealth, and China is willing to go to any lengths to ensure it gets it. To add to the economic prize of the region, the area is also home to some of the world's largest remaining fisheries, and Chinese fishing vessels are already plundering the territorial waters of the nations that ring the South China Sea. These fishing vessels have used water cannons to force the fishing ships of other nations away, and with Chinese Navy warships never far away, so far nobody has bothered to fight back. Only the United States has the military might to challenge China's illegal claims, and it has done so repeatedly. Undertaking what is internationally known as freedom of navigation exercises, U.S. ships and planes have routinely moved through the waters that the Chinese military claim as its own around the many artificial islands China has built in the region. Under normal international law, military warships of other nations must pass through the territorial water of a sovereign nation as quickly as possible through the most expedient route possible. The U.S., in a bid to delegitimize the claims by China, has instead opted to sail its ships in a zigzag pattern through the disputed waters, purposefully not sailing as expeditiously as possible, nor taking the most direct route possible. This places China in a difficult position as it can't legitimately claim national sovereignty when the warships of another nation flagrantly disregard that sovereignty. And unlike the small fleets of Vietnam, Borneo, Malaysia, the Philippines, or Burma, the U.S. Navy isn't so easily bullied away by Chinese ships. Instead, China has been forced to respond with everything short of outright force, often shadowing U.S. ships with its own or intercepting U.S. Navy planes on approach to the illegal bases China has built in the region. While so far this hasn't led to a serious incident, thanks on the part by restraint exercised on both sides, this year's laser flashing incident was indicative of China's willingness to push the issue with potentially catastrophic results. Had the U.S. pilots been physically looking in the direction of the laser flash, the high-powered beam could have permanently damaged the vision of the aviators, potentially putting the entire aircraft at risk. So what if the U.S. Navy had lost the entire crew of a P-8 Poseidon? For the U.S., that would have meant the death of at least 9 American sailors, as each P-8 carries mission support crew including intelligence personnel handling many of the plane's extremely sensitive instruments. With U.S. ships in the region already on high alert around Chinese installation and ships, the loss of an entire aircraft to direct hostile action by China
could have immediate consequences. In all likelihood, the US would attempt to use restraint and authorize only a tit-for-tat response, likely targeting and destroying an expensive but unmanned Chinese military installation along the disputed island chains. If instead the Navy P-8 had been shot down by actual Chinese weapons, and not just accidentally downed by blinding the pilots, the response would be far different. The US faces a very serious choice. If it refuses to take retributive action, then it threatens to at last fully legitimize Chinese claims to the area, not to mention lose major international face as it essentially bows to China as the superior Pacific power. This is, well, unlikely to say the least, and an actual shoot-down of a US plane by Chinese forces would likely lead to an overwhelming military response. That response, however, would be limited to the specific installation the attack originated from in a bid to allow China the option of not escalating the conflict into all-out war. China would have to accept the loss of what would likely be several missile batteries and a radar and communication station, along with the men manning those resources, or it could choose to escalate the conflict. Escalation would be unlikely, however, as, simply put, the US is by far the superior power in the Pacific. While China can threaten US forces with a large stockpile of ballistic missiles, its Navy is simply no match for the firepower of the US Navy. And most importantly, China has not yet demonstrated that it has the ability to keep its targeting networks for its ballistic missile forces operational past first contact with American forces. Even if, somehow, China's ballistic missile kill chain remains intact, an extremely dubious proposition, its total stockpile is limited, and once those missiles run out, it will be up to the Chinese Navy to fend off the US's Pacific forces, which would by then be bolstered by ships from the Atlantic Fleet. This is a task it is simply not equipped to undertake. Further complicating problems for China is the US's vast fleet of submarines, an asset that is routinely overlooked by military planners on both sides, and that's something that the US's Silent Service, as it's known, is more than happy with. With an extremely limited anti-submarine warfare capability, China's Navy would be decimated by this undersea fleet, and with the vast majority of its trade coming through the ocean, an economic blockade of China would lead to a catastrophic consequence for the nation. In the end, it's in the best interest of both sides that no such conflict takes place. While the US would doubtlessly emerge victorious, it would be a costly victory with the greatest losses the Navy will have endured since World War II. With China as its greatest trading partner, the US economy would take a huge hit as well. Though unlike China, the US could redirect much commerce elsewhere. Still, a fully armed confrontation between the two nations would have dire consequences for the world, and is not a proposition either side wants to see. And yet, China continues to build upon and expand on what detractors have taken to calling landlocked aircraft carriers in the South China Sea, unwilling to obey international law and continuing to bully its neighbors. This leaves not just the fate of the South Pacific, but the very peace and stability it currently enjoys hanging in the balance, and this time, it's China whose actions will determine what the history books say about war in the 21st century. If this scenario seems far-fetched, perhaps it's not as far off as one might think, as an armed confrontation very nearly occurred between the US and China back in 2001. On April 1st of that year, a US Navy reconnaissance aircraft was operating near yet another disputed Chinese encampment, this time on the Parcel Islands, when it was intercepted by two Chinese J-8 fighters. In a bid to intimidate the Americans, one of the J-8 pilots undertook two high-speed flybys of the big US plane. But on the third attempt, the pilot completely misjudged his skills and rammed straight into the American EP-3E. The impact split the J-8 into two pieces and severely damaged the American plane, which was sent to an uncontrolled dive. Incredibly, the American pilot was able to recover the aircraft, and severely damaged, it immediately sent a distress signal to a nearby Chinese airfield. The Chinese ignored 15 distress calls, and finally, the American plane simply decided to land on the Chinese runway regardless of permission or not, as the pilot did not believe he could keep the plane aloft any longer. The only casualties of the incident was the Chinese pilot, who was likely crushed to death on impact and unable to eject. Immediately after the incident, and despite the US releasing flight data from the onboard recorder, China claimed that it was the US plane that caused the collision by purposefully turning into the passing Chinese plane. This claim was in short ludicrous and largely ignored by the international community, especially since China never released the flight data from its own aircraft black box. Things in the South China Sea remain tense, and a major incident between the two nations is only one provocation away. What happens next is largely in China's hands, but one thing is for sure, it is unlikely to back down from its claims in the South China Sea, and sadly, conflict seems likely.
In a recent press interview, President Joe Biden confirmed that United States men and women would fight to defend Taiwan from a Chinese invasion. This prompted immediate outrage from China, who claimed the U.S. was violating its own One China policy. In response, President Biden ordered U.S. and Canadian warships to sail through the Taiwan Strait. For decades, the U.S. operated under a strategic ambiguity in regards to Taiwan, never truly committing to its defense, but strongly hinting that it would oppose a Chinese invasion with military force of its own. This had served as a diplomatic lubricant between the U.S. and China, as China sees reunification with Taiwan as a matter of not just national pride, but of survival for the Chinese Communist Party. A free and independent Taiwan is a direct affront to Chinese attempts to become a global superpower, something it has yet to achieve. If the nation can't neutralize one renegade province right off its own shores, it'll never be able to be a credible global power. For the CCP, Taiwan's democracy is an existential threat on their own grip on Chinese power. Now, President Biden has said the quiet part out loud, and China can expect to face U.S. forces if it attempts to invade Taiwan. But just what would the U.S. do in case of an invasion? A Chinese invasion of Taiwan could only take place during the 2 or 3 week window in either spring or fall, when the tides are favorable. Chinese forces could also only land on a limited number of beaches suitable for the offloading of infantry and vehicles, and all of these are highly defended and booby-trapped in advance. Further, an invasion would take months to prepare, giving Taiwan ample warning and allowing its Navy time to mine the Taiwan Strait. It would be the most costly military operation in terms of life and resources since the great battles of World War II, and even without the U.S. aid, China is unlikely to succeed despite its overwhelming size advantage. Much like the Greeks at Thermopylae, Taiwan is in a strategically superior position that allows its smaller forces to fend off China's hordes. In case of war, the U.S. response would be by air and sea, and it's unlikely the U.S. ground forces would come into play at all in the fighting. However, it's not impossible that U.S. Marine and Army forces could be committed to the defense of the small island in small numbers to bolster Taiwan's defenders. The first thing that would happen in case of a war is American submarines would begin their deadly work of decimating Chinese vessels. Despite an increasing capability in anti-submarine warfare, China's ASW abilities are still lacking, and U.S. submarines are very good at remaining hidden. The American Silent Service would be tasked with ambushing Chinese vessels attempting to navigate the Taiwan Strait, striking with surgical precision at troop transports and support ships, which would be more valuable kills given their limited numbers than actual warships. If China can't move troops and equipment across the strait, it can't invade after all. The Taiwan Strait would be a perilous place for any vessel to operate in, and U.S. submarine losses would occur, but losses on the Chinese side would be significantly higher. Up north, just south of Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula, a single American Ohio-class submarine converted to carry cruise missiles would launch a devastating attack against the oil pipeline connecting China to Russia. This would leave China with only one route for oil to take over land into the nation, throttling down China's oil supply. Oil would be the key to victory, as any modern economy requires it to function. China, however, is extremely vulnerable to trade disruption. This is largely the reason that the U.S. has paid little heed to China's threats. Approximately 60% of China's trade, including oil, travels by the sea, and this is China's Achilles heel. The nation might have the world's largest navy, but largest doesn't mean most capable, and China's navy has some serious deficiencies. For starters, its numbers are greatly inflated by smaller missile boats, and it lacks the logistical or defensive capabilities to send its ships far from its own shores. This means that while China's navy could operate around Taiwan's territorial waters, sending them much farther out to sea than that would be a deadly mistake. This is a situation that China has tried to rectify by expanding its influence in the South China Sea via artificial islands. These man-made floating airfields are packed to the brim with long-range missiles and attack aircraft, but they simply can't do enough to protect China's overseas trade. That's because any ship bringing oil to China must pass through the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, giving the United States 2 choke points to strangle China to death economically. Even before hostilities broke out, U.S. naval forces would be moving toward the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. American warships stationed right outside the Gulf of Oman would act as a first line of denial to Chinese oil shipping. To the east, the Straits of Malacca would be cut off to Chinese ships by the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The end result is a near-total oil embargo on China that would leave it reliant on its own western overland pipes from Russia, which are, for the moment, out of reach of U.S. weapons. However, it's not unthinkable that in case of war, the U.S. wouldn't fly B-2 stealth bombers north through India to strike at these connections with standoff munitions. With very frosty relations between India and China, India is very likely to allow U.S. bombers to operate in its airspace for the mission. Even without striking these oil pipelines, though, China's oil imports would be reduced to a trickle, having immediate repercussions for its economy that would only worsen over time. If you've ever wondered why China hasn't actually invaded Taiwan yet, it's largely because the United States Navy has its foot on China's throat, and it would require minimal pressure to choke the country to death economically. U.S. carriers would doubtlessly join the fight in the skies over Taiwan, although to be honest, U.S. forces never need engage China if they simply carry out a blockade strategy. The only reason U.S. Air Forces would engage Chinese forces would be to carry out America's chief objectives in case of a war with China, the destruction of its air and naval forces so as to neutralize it as a future threat. Flying from airfields in South Korea and Japan, U.S. Air Force fighters could join the fight over Taiwan with the aid of aerial tankers, and operating out of aircraft carriers in the Pacific, U.S. Navy aviators would also be on the front lines against Chinese forces. However, American carriers would be under serious threat from Chinese ballistic missile attack, and that's why the U.S. Navy is working to greatly expand the combat radius of its fighters. The Navy's next-generation fighter, already in development, has a strict requirement of a combat range increase of up to 50%. Meaning the airframe will have to be significantly larger than the current F-18 Hornet or F-35. However, in the meantime, the Navy's also developing a fleet of drone tanker aircraft that can accompany fighters and top them off right before entering combat ranges. This would help put U.S. ships out of range of most, but not all, of China's long-range missiles. But it's at best a stopgap measure, as missile technology will continue to evolve, giving the weapons longer and longer ranges. Yet the U.S. remains confident it can operate its carriers in the Pacific in case of war. Fleet air defense vessels such as the Aegis cruisers can take on ballistic missiles with their complement of SM-3 missiles, which intercept ballistic missiles outside of Earth's atmosphere. To aid in their own defense, U.S. carriers are fast, very fast vessels for their size, with a publicly listed top speed of 35 miles per hour. However, it's a well-known fact that American supercarriers can move significantly faster than this when required, with a top speed that's classified. 35 miles an hour might not sound like much, but when you're targeting a vessel hundreds of miles from your launch site, this means that by the time your weapon nears the vessel's original coordinates, it's long gone. This is why modern long-range munitions require very robust surveillance, tracking, and targeting capabilities in the form of drones, AWACS aircraft, undersea sensors, and satellites, amongst others. Each of these assets forms one link in a long kill chain where platforms feed targeting data to an incoming missile. While China has made great leaps and bounds in its ability to hit U.S. ships at sea, it remains to be seen if China's kill chains can survive hostile contact with the U.S. forces. This by no means U.S. supercarriers are safe, and the platform is likely an outdated concept that we should very strongly consider scrapping in favor of more smaller carriers that leave the U.S. Navy less vulnerable to overwhelming losses from a single attack. Once American fighters are in the air, China will find itself facing the most advanced aerospace forces in the world. But this does not make U.S. planes invulnerable. In fact, China fields a longer-range air-to-air missile than the U.S. currently does, the PL-15. This missile has a slightly greater range than the American AIM-120D AMRAAM, giving Chinese fighters the advantage in a first-look, first-shoot confrontation. This is set to change in the next few years as the U.S. fields the AIM-260, which has a classified range but is believed to reach at least 186 miles, which is the range China's own next-generation missile, the PL-21, is expected to have. However, to actually hit U.S. fighters, China must detect them first, and this is why the U.S. spearhead will be its fleet of fifth-generation stealth aircraft. While not invisible to enemy radar, China's frontline fighters currently can't target American F-35s and F-22s until they're within approximately 35 miles, which eliminates China's slight edge in long-range air-to-air missiles. American fighters would be opening fire well before China's knew they were there. But stealth comes with a serious vulnerability, a lack of payload capacity. Flying in stealth configuration, a US F-35 is limited to 4 AIM-120s and 2 Sidewinders. This does not bode well given the fact that China would be committing dozens of aircraft at a time to the fight. While US stealth fighters would be able to knock out China's front fighter screens, it's unlikely they'd be able to penetrate deep enough to strike at Chinese bombers, launching devastating standoff attacks against Taiwanese targets. To do so, US fighters would have to fly in murder configuration, fully loaded with missiles on wing pylons and thus destroying their stealth signature. China has its own stealth fighters for the US to worry about. The Chengdu J-20 is an inferior fifth-generation fighter, the bottom of the pile when compared to the F-22, F-35, and Russia's Su-57. It has decidedly non-stealthy features such as canards and engine outlets, and it's believed that it uses inferior radar-absorbent materials in its construction. To boot, China operates only about 150 of these aircraft, meaning they're in limited supply. Yet even inferior stealth is still stealth, and Chinese J-20s would pose a serious threat to American air support assets, such as tankers and AWACS, both critical platforms badly needed for modern air campaigns. Armed with long-range PL-15s, J-20s could easily stay out of detection of American AWACS and fire their missiles, all but certainly bringing these valuable air assets down. To date, the US does not have a firm solution to this problem, which would be magnified by the fact that Chinese aircraft would be operating so close to home and thus within easy range of ground and naval-based air defenses. The battle in the sky over Taiwan would turn to one of attrition, which the US would inevitably win over time, but not without taking significant losses of even its precious fifth-generation fighters. The sooner the American public accepts that the F-22 and F-35 are not invulnerable, the better position America will be to accept combat losses and continue to muster the will to fight, because China would be looking to knock the US out of the fight not by military might, but by eroding public support for the war. After 20 years of disastrous adventurism in the Middle East, the American people have little stomach for yet another protracted military campaign against a foe that isn't necessarily threatening them directly. It's China's hope that it can cut the knees out from under America by inflicting large losses and shocking the American people. Yet, defending Taiwan is of critical national defense importance to the United States. Allowing the island nation to fall to China would severely undermine U.S. dominance of the Pacific, as it would give China the ability to break what's known as the First Island Chain of Containment. This is a chain of islands that hems China in from Japan down to the Philippines and has served as a barrier to Chinese naval expansion into the Pacific. Taiwan, however, is important to the U.S. and to the entire free world for another reason. Right now, the island nation supplies much of the world's supply of microchips and other computer components. Allowing this manufacturing capability to fall into the hands of the Chinese means that along with its own production capability, China would become the largest global supplier of these components critical to modern industry and militaries both. The Taiwanese embargo alone was a crippling blow to Russia's ability to manufacture new precision munitions. With China in control of the world's computer component manufacturing, it would effectively give the nation the ability to blackmail any other nation in the world and bully it into doing its bidding. This includes even the US. Do what China wants or else you get cut off from the critical supplies needed to keep your modern economy working. This is a strategic threat so great that even European powers have pledged some amount of support for Taiwan's continued independence. Luckily for Taiwan, though, the world's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has put a serious damper on China's ambition to conquer Taiwan. The unprecedented response from the West has shown China the lengths it's willing to go to in order to counter the aggression of authoritarian governments against free nations. Rumors swirl that China was actually planning to take military action this fall, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine completely derailed those plans. The last thing that China wants is to become a second global pariah, especially as its own economy faces some very serious internal disasters in the very near future. Now go check out World War III Hour by Hour, or click this other video instead.